a couple more colleagues. Okay. We're expecting a couple more colleagues to come in. I would just quickly welcome you all here to the Graduate Institute, to the Maison de la Paix. And to kick off our meeting, the first speaker we have for the introductions is Elise Conda, who's the Chief of Resources and Markets Branch at the UN Environment Programme. And as you'll see from the agenda, the meeting today is hosted by 3 organizations, all of whom have come at this question of trade, nature, biodiversity, bioeconomy from slightly different perspectives. And so it will mean for a very rich and very full discussion, but we thought it's quite unique to bring these actors together to try and spur this brainstorming today. I won't say anything else now because first on the agenda is Elisa. So I'll let her introduce, and then Julie, and then I'll say some words to get the conversation going. Go ahead, Elisa, please.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I'm going to add my voice to welcoming everybody to this roundtable on nature positive trade rules for sustainable development. And thank you very much, and your colleagues at the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, as well as Julie and the colleagues at NatureFinance for having agreed to create with us this space for a conversation, for a brainstorming among all of us on this important issue. And Caroline and colleagues, where I wanted to go is actually to step a little bit back in time and start from UNEP 6 this year, the 6th session of the UN Environment Assembly, where one of the initiatives that is supported by the branch, which is the International Resource Panel, launched the Global Resources Outlook 2024. And some of the figures and some of the facts and some of the recommendations of the scientists behind this report, I feel, are good food for thought for our conversation today, because they are actually reminding us the extraction of natural resources from Earth has tripled in the past 5 decades. And this is very much linked to the need of new infrastructure and the increase in our consumptions level, particularly in upper middle and high income countries. And they have represented for us also the trajectory of these demand of natural resources. And their estimation is that material extraction is actually expected to rise by 60% by 2060. And these mere trajectory is actually going to challenge our capacity to achieve our global climate, biodiversity, and pollution target, as well as it's going to put a strain on our vision to increase our economic prosperity and in human well-being. And as I was mentioning to you, they are actually offering, in the context of this report, 5 main directions on which they are suggesting that we concentrate our attention. And I just want to put them on the table because I feel several of them are really very pertinent for our conversation today. A first line of recommendation is really very much bringing very strongly the resource and the resource governance direction in the framework of implementing multilateral environmental agreements, and therefore being more explicit on the role of resources in achieving benchmarks and targets set in this context. Second line of recommendation is one around directing finance towards more sustainable resource use, particularly reflecting the true cost of resources in the structure of our economy, in subsidies, in regulations, in taxes, in decision around infrastructure, as well as making sure that decisions around private finance are very much keeping into consideration also aspects around sustainable resource use. Third line of recommendation is one that speaks to consumption. As I was reflecting at the beginning, one of the big drivers of those trends in resource use is consumption decisions, and therefore making sure that consumers, very broadly, not only individual consumers, but also government as a consumer through its public procurement really have a clear notion of the impact of the consumption decision and has the right information that enable to make the right choice. The fourth line of recommendation is one related to trade and making trade an engine of sustainable resource use, creating a level playing field in which, again, the true cost, environmental and social costs of goods and the resources within it are fully accounted for. And the fifth line of work is one that pushes, encourages the shift towards more circular, resource efficient, and low impact solution and business models in our economy. So all in all, the message from the report is one in which it stresses that the curve, the trajectory of our resource use has still not been bent, but there are clear directions that would enable us to bend that curve if we concentrate in taking those decisions in the context of built environment, in the context of mobility and of the food and energy systems. And where I would like to go next is also to remind us that same at the sixth session of UNEP, while there were a number of resolutions on the table for negotiation that had very explicit references, for example, to bioeconomy. Caroline, you alluded to that in the introduction, and not all of these moved ahead. There's a one interesting resolution that I feel is worthwhile looking at, while very specific in focus because it concentrates on the sugarcane agro-industry. It has a very interesting preambular part that really speaks into the role of resources, and particularly natural resources, into being managed in such a way that they really help us addressing the triple planetary crisis. And I cannot refrain from pushing us to reflect how the conversation that we will be having today is also a good source of inspiration that we might keep in mind when we're seeing the interest that is that exist in the context of the G20 process, and particularly in the context of the Brazilian presidency of this year to the G20 process, where there is a very specific work stream that is looking at bioeconomy. And not only, many of us are also very closely linked to intergovernmental and global discussions, for example, around the role of minerals for the energy transition. And definitely, this speaks very much to some of the dichotomy of working across and understanding the trade-offs across the different dimensions of the planetary crisis. So this is what I would want to leave as an element for our discussion today, really thinking through how resources, natural resources, and the trade of natural resources is an important aspect to be considered across environmental dimensions, and in the interest of really supporting a sustainable development of country and human well-being. Caroline, once again, thanks to you for joining hand with us, and thanks to the colleague of NatureFinance for having worked with us to prepare this session, and looking forward to our very wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Elisa, for that, and for really putting the natural resource issue at the center of this discussion. I'm going to turn directly to Julie for your welcoming comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, Elisa. So my name is Julie McCarthy. I'm the co-CEO at NatureFinance, calling in from just outside of New York. Just again, a huge thanks to TESS and to UNEP for co-hosting this convening with us. Very happy to have my colleague Mark Halley in the room today to help lead today's discussion, and to just have succeeded on very short notice in gathering such a distinguished group of experts together today for this brainstorm on nature positive trade rules to support sustainable development. As many of you know, NatureFinance's mission is to help align global finance with more equitable and nature-positive outcomes. And I wanted to just kick off by giving a little context for why NatureFinance was keen to help arrange this discussion today. So back in 2022, NatureFinance convened an 18-month-long task force on nature markets that was made up of eminent experts from around the world to consider both the risks and the opportunities presented by the growth of nature markets globally. This group included everyone from the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan, to an indigenous leader from the Amazon, Chief Almir Sarui, to leaders like Carlos Manuel Rodriguez from Jeff and Carlos Lopez of the Africa Climate Foundation. So it was a really broad range of expertise and perspectives there. The task force culminated its work in August of last year and launched its final report in Belém in the Amazon. And of their 7 core recommendations, number 1 was the urgent need to align the international economic and financial architecture with an equitable global nature economy, starting with trade and investment rules. I think there was a real recognition by the task force last year of the growing international attempts to address the biodiversity and climate crises and meet the ambitions of the global biodiversity framework through increased supply chain regulation, for example, as exemplified by the EU deforestation regulations, new EU corporate responsibility requirements, and efforts like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, as we all know it. I think there was also a keen understanding that however well-intentioned these measures might be, they've also become a real source of tension for low and middle income countries who worry that these unilateral approaches unfairly place the burden and the cost of transition to a post-carbon and nature-positive economy on poorer, nature-rich, commodity exporting countries. And indeed, I think we've seen this play out even in recent weeks with the EU-Mercosur trade deal, where despite the kind of love affair between Macron and Lula during Macron's recent visit to Brazil, there are really serious tensions that remain about the role of climate and biodiversity commitments within that agreement. I think more broadly, we're seeing growing fears that climate and nature-focused policy initiatives aimed at markets will constrain development rather than help advance it. I think this is of particular concern for us in nature-rich, low and middle-income countries, but this kind of risk-based narrative around nature-positive trade and investment isn't just limited to that cohort. We're also, of course, seeing backlash and slowdown in different ways on climate and nature policy commitments in the UK and in Europe, in the US, both at the governmental and the kind of corporate and financial institution level. So at NatureFinance, we're very concerned that the discussion around nature, finance, and trade continues to be dominated by this kind of downside narrative of risks and threats to investment and growth, rather than one that's balanced by opportunity and innovation, which is why we're really excited to be bringing the bioeconomy discussion into the brainstorm today, because for us, the bioeconomy is an example of where integrating nature and sustainability into trade can be a real upside source of economic opportunity for nature-rich countries, and one where we're seeing significant investment opportunities as well as growing political energy. So we've seen Brazil demonstrate extraordinary leadership this year in creating a G20 bioeconomy working group during its presidency and advancing broader discussions around how to leverage biodiversity as an engine for enterprise growth and sustainable development. As you'll hear from my former colleague, Courtney Lawrence, shortly, a G20 stock take that we recently helped author puts the bioeconomy currently at a total global value of around $4 trillion, with the World Bioeconomy Forum predicting that it will grow up to 30 trillion by 2050. So a pretty significant chunk of the global economy if it can reach its full potential. We're working hard to support Brazil in extending its bioeconomy working group effort beyond its tenure to South Africa's presidency next year. And it's an area where we really want to help nature-rich, low and middle-income countries in particular provide leadership in the years to come in terms of advancing a nature-positive global economy and approaches to trade governance that really serve sustainable development for all. So in terms of today's conversation, we really hope that it will generate some new ideas and perspectives on, first, how we think about incentivizing nature-positive global supply and investment value chains in ways that really respect the needs and concerns of low and middle-income countries, especially nature-rich countries, how nature and climate-positive trade can address core development concerns around inequality, food security, employment, and what role the bioeconomy can play as a kind of infrastructure to help advance nature-positive trade and investment approaches among different actors. So I will leave it there in the interest of time, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie, for setting the scene. So on the agenda, it also says I will provide some reframing remarks, but I think probably enough has been said. And I will turn us on to our main agenda. But just briefly to say, from TESS, I mean, we were created just over 2 years ago to promote inclusive cooperation and action on trade and sustainability. Of our 4 main themes, we have one on the climate crisis, one on circular economy, one on plastic pollution, and another on nature, food, and natural resources. So for us, this brainstorming is really a way for us to help think through where is it that we can best contribute in that space around nature, food, and natural resources. And again, with this lens of trying to foster international cooperation on these issues, our focus is very much on the multilateral trade setting. So in that, from that perspective, what we think, what we're very keen to think more about is where can trade rules and policies block progress towards the achievement of the goals that we have collectively set around nature? Where can they both make a positive difference, trade policies and rules? And so if we wanted to have a trading system that supported nature, what would that look like? So we're willing both to be quite pragmatic and incremental in the short term. Where is the current agenda and how can we move countries forward? But we'd also like to be engaged in a sort of stepping back exercise to say, well, what if we were to think anew, pragmatically, but also anew about what kind of rules and policies would need to be in place that were really supportive of, nature positive trade and also bioeconomy. So and in that regard, it may be, some may say the status quo is just fine, the action needs to happen elsewhere. Our feeling is the status quo is not fine. I mean, there are certainly things we know where trade policies are standing in the way of some of our nature goals, and we're quite convinced that there are things that could be done that would be more proactive. But we are also an organization that's very committed to inclusive and just approaches to these issues. So for us, a core thing that anchors our work is what would work for nature, but also our broader sustainable development goals at the global level. So that's where we're interested, hoping today that people can step out of their boxes. We can be very much in brainstorming mode and think, well, if we're looking at a 10-year horizon or a 20-year horizon, what do we really need to be aiming for in terms of what this system looks like and what might need to change in that context. So that's all from my point of view. I think it will be good. So the way that the agenda today is structured is we have a little bit of scene setting in the first session. We're about 15 minutes behind time, but I don't think we should spend all afternoon rushing because we think we're behind time. I think it is what it is. We started a little later. The first session is really about setting the scene about what are some of the key trends and challenges, because there's many experts here already. None of you are new to this issue, but I think already from this morning, it's interesting to hear how different kinds of organizations approach it from different perspectives. So we'll get some of that in session 1. Session 2 is very much, it's going to be a bit more technical on what really is the state of play and opportunities or different pathways around the rules and the policies. And then part 3 is really going to be about how does one foster cooperation in this space, especially given some of the challenges that Julie had mentioned. And in that session, that middle section around the rules, we need to look at what's going wrong, where can they play more of a role, how could they change. So I think as we've got, I mentioned we're about 15 minutes behind, but I would love just to very quickly just do a quick tour of the top so you all know who's in the room. We have a really excellent group, or in the virtual room and real room. It's a small group, but I think we have a fantastic firepower and brain power in this room, actually. And I think Gabrielle is arriving, so perfect timing. So maybe I'll start. We already have Julie, but just say your name and your titles, just so we know where you're from, and then we can start the real conversation. And I'll turn back to Julie and Mark to moderate the first session. So maybe start with you, Courtney.
Sure. Hi, I'm Courtney Lawrence. I am a director within NatureVest at the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you. We go to Marianne.
Hi everyone, my name is Marianne Kettunen and I've been working with the Trade, Development and the Environment Hub, which is a UK-funded project on trade and biodiversity for the past couple of years, and working specifically on nature-positive trade for nature and biodiversity.
Super, thank you, Marianne. And then Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Peter Nelson. I'm an impact investment manager with the Common Fund for Commodities, where I'm a lead on climate and biodiversity related trade or investments.
Super, Marcus.
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. Good time of the day. Markus Lehmann, heading the economics unit here in the Convention Secretariat, CBD Secretariat. And we're covering, amongst other things, also the trade-related issues.
Thank you, Marcus. Jaya?
Hi, everyone. This is Jaya from the UN Environment Program's Environment and Trade team. In the team, we work on trade and several high-impact sectors. And my colleague Beatrice is in the room today, and very pleased to join you all.
Thank you. And then Kolo?
Hi everyone, and thank you for convening this session. My name is Kolo Kugler, and I'm counsel at the Advisory Center in WTO Law, essentially trying to support developing countries to grapple with some of these measures. Thank you.
Thank you. Yanni?
Hi, I just got on. So hi everyone, I guess.
We're just doing names and affiliations.
Oh, okay. Hi everyone. Sorry to be late. It's 8:30 in the Caribbean. My name is Jani Bremy. I'm the director for the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services. We call ourselves the SRC. And really great to be here. We're beginning to think about how to push the work we're doing from beyond just the normal biodiversity. So this for me is just like a initial dive in. So thanks for the invite, and looking forward to hearing more from everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jan. And then we have Atulia just wrote to say that she has, oh, please, if you could just speak. I think you put it
My
in the
internet
chat.
is a bit unstable, so I don't have the camera on. I'm Atulia, I'm based in Sweden, and I work as a project manager at NatureFinance. Glad to meet you all.
Super, thank you very much. Can we just do a super quick round in the room, starting with Svetlana, please?
Hey everyone, my name is Svetlana Tubanova. I work at the WTO Trade Environment Division.
Hello, I'm Yasmin Ismail, Policy Advisor at TESS.
I'm Mark Halley, Senior Advisor at NatureFinance.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorena Jaramillo, Economic Affairs Officer for UN Trade and Development Division.
Hi everyone, I'm Otona Verdes. I'm Senior Expert for Natural Resources Economics. I work for IUCN, the International Union for Conservation, here in England, Switzerland.
Hello everyone, I'm Antoine Bonnet. I work at the IISD as a policy advisor, focusing on border carbon adjustments, subsidies, as well as critical raw minerals.
My name is Beatrice Fernandez. I work with the Environment and Trade team at UNEP. That is part also of the branch that Elisa leads. And we have a portfolio on nature positive trade and agriculture through the Trade Hub project that Marianne mentioned. And thanks again for the invitation, Caroline and Julie, for the collaboration.
Hi, my name is Cookie Haptagaber. I've been working on integrating nature into finance back at Earth Summit in 2011. I helped set it up together with UNEP and others. And since then, I've been working with WWF, leading their green economy work globally. And recently, I've been doing some consultancy work. Yeah, so I'm very glad to hear this topic has grown since 2011, and that there are lots of advances. So I'm very keen to hear about how trade could be integrated. Thank you for the invite.
Gabrielle Marceau, I work in research in the WTO. I also teach at the University of Geneva, and I'm old, like some of us here. And I've been sort of caring and working on trade and environment, I think, for more than 30 years. So I continue here.
Hi everyone, I'm Christoph Bellman, and head of policy analysis and strategy at TESS.
Hi, I'm Aaron Cosby. I have a few hats, but I think today I'm wearing my hat as a senior associate with IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, along with my colleague Antoine. And like Gabrielle, I'm old.
We're all young today. We're all young today.
We're all young ones. Right? ONCE, not ONCE. I'm Vice U. I think I'm just coming off from you hear I have many hats. But my latest hat, which I'm just coming off from, is as the Trade and Markets Lead for the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue, which is this sort of like informal intergovernmental dialogue organized by the UK and Indonesia at COP26 in Glasgow, which we have then kept running for the past two years. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you very much, Vice. So as you see, we have a great group bringing together some real trade expertise, a lot of experience on biodiversity, nature, sustainability, and also the finance community. So it's a nice mix. So with that, I will just turn back to, is Mark going to lead the session on behalf of Julie? Well, okay, let's do that. So
okay, you have, thanks, Carolyn. Yeah. You have Julie on the agenda, but we figured that since I'm in the room and she's on Zoom, it might be easier if I facilitate this first session. Thanks all of you for setting the scene so well. I think you will have gathered from the introductions that we feel that the time is right to revisit the issues and opportunities that lie at the interface between trade policy and practice, and the requirements of addressing biodiversity loss. So it's not a new issue, as Marcus knows. It goes way back in terms of the relationship between WTO and the Convention on Biological Diversity, but the world has changed since then. And so perhaps today is a really good opportunity to begin looking afresh at some of the challenges and how we can address them. That means, of course, understanding how trade is addressing biodiversity. And of course, a great deal is happening in the WTO and more broadly in the multilateral trading system on addressing the challenges of biodiversity. We also should be asking ourselves how sensitive the biodiversity world is, or the world of biodiversity action, to the pros and the cons of operating within the current trade system. I think in addition, we should perhaps recognize the fact that we are in a time when protectionism is growing all around the world, and that the prospects of increased protectionism, I'm afraid, are fairly dire. If you look at US elections or the elections in Europe in June, there's some real challenges out there. And so one of the questions I think we should be asking ourselves is also how do we make a world where protectionism is growing at least damaging to the needs of nature and biodiversity protection. And in the end, what I hope we come out with is the elements to craft an agenda on this and then discuss how we go further. So this is really a brainstorming. It's to put ideas on the table, it's to put challenges on the table. It's not to illustrate the work that we're all doing, but to imagine what kind of work might be most useful in period. And to kick us off, Julie mentioned the rapidly growing importance of the bioeconomy, the G20 initiative under Brazil on the bioeconomy, and the decision by South Africa to keep it going next year. So the bioeconomy is rising very quickly, and obviously there are very strong trade aspects to that. To take us through that with some opening thoughts, I'd like to call on Courtney. Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so I want to start with a little bit of an example or a case, and it really highlights for me the trends that we're seeing in the bioeconomy and the urgency, I think, of making sure we get the framework right. So in a previous role, I was a banker at Citi, and there was a French chemicals company called Arkema that was a big client of ours. They had the biggest capital project in their history that they brought to us for funding, and it was what they call as a bio manufacturing facility that they constructed in Singapore. They issued a green bond for this facility. So it was, had pricing advantages in the sustainable debt capital markets. And the product that they're manufacturing is called Rilson. It's a bio-based polyamide, which is basically a bio-based plastic. As a green bond issuance, the first thing we needed to do was to find out, where's the raw material coming from? Is this really climate friendly? Their driving agenda was the circular economy agenda in Europe and more broadly globally. It was climate, so they were looking for low carbon materials, and they saw a really big opportunity, growing market opportunity in Asia. They also, not surprisingly, had their feedstock in Asia. So this product is made from castor seed in India. And so they were working with farmers to procure the castor seed that would then go to Singapore to produce this bio-based plastic that then goes globally to all sorts of industries, from automotive to packaging to, a lot of industries. And so that was sort of the wake-up point for me when I took the opportunity to work with NatureFinance to do the stock take on the bioeconomy, because there's a lot of private sector multinational companies that are being incentivized by governments to produce low carbon bio-based materials. And they are, as everyone has mentioned so far, going to the global south for the most part to get the raw material. So when we did the stock take, really 4 trends come out pretty strongly. The first one is that there's a huge expansion of bio-based industries worldwide. It's everything from small, medium enterprises to the biggest global multinationals. And it's across sectors. So you can find bio-based industries. Biofuels is a big one. Chemicals, which I just mentioned, bioplastics, bio-based textiles. There's an incredible expanding market for bio-based textiles and bio-based construction materials. So it's really starting to become, find its way into industrial strategies. The second, so the trade implications, I'll quickly give you a trade implication for each one. The trade implications of that is obviously bio-based, the biomass flows. Where is the biomass coming? And how does it flow through the economy? Likely through many countries. And what are the alternative purposes of the land required for those raw materials? Because there are going to be trade-offs that people have mentioned. The second big trend that we've seen is really around government support and policies. So many governments around the world, the EU is a classic example, are promoting bio-based industries largely to reduce carbon emissions. And they're putting in policies that include everything from research and development to tax incentives to subsidies to public procurement. And that's where the stock take, I think, was really rich in identifying the extent of government policies across the G20. Obviously, the trade implications are significant. The tariff, I think subsidy reform is a big one, but also looking at preferential tariffs, export promotion, the sustainability criteria and trade agreements, all of these things, certification and labeling schemes, all of these things are trade-related implications. The third big trend is technological advancement. So this is a huge one that it keeps me awake a little bit at night, mostly because it deals with intellectual property and again, the fairness of our trade system. And so if you, again, I think Julie mentioned, and maybe Mark, the size of the economy, there is one prediction that it will be a third of global GDP by 2050. So, and that's largely driven by the US, China, and India, who are really coming at those estimates from synthetic biology and biotechnology. And so when you get into those spaces, then for me, it's all about access and benefit sharing and the intellectual property for that biotech. And then finally, the last big trend is really around collaboration and partnerships. And that's not just government to government, which I think recently there is a partnership announced between Korea and the US. So there are government to government partnerships happening around the bioeconomy. But it's also value chain partnerships. So if I go back to my example of Arkema in the chemical sector, they actually, because they do care about sustainable sourcing and they want it to be a sustainable product, they actually had to work with the other value chain players, not just the producers of the castor seed in India, but actually all the buyers of the castor seed, because they need security of supply, but they also needed a collaboration to help ensure the sustainability at the farm level. So they collectively worked with the chemicals industry, who also had sourcing that overlapped. So I'll stop there. I hope this provides some food for thought. I think it connects to a number of the discussions that we'll be having. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Courtney, for that very interesting introduction. Quick question to you. I mean, if you look at these developments in the bioeconomy and assume that they are accelerating and moving forward and replacing a number of the economic production systems that we have, how much of that can be easily accommodated by the current trade rules, and how much needs to go back and look at those trade rules to ensure that trade rules are not impeding the welcome progress in this direction?
Well, I'll give you my thoughts and then invite others who I'm sure have perspectives. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly because as a global economy, we're still not very good at even understanding biomass flows, understanding what is a bio-based product or a bioeconomy product. And so the work of UNCTAD and others on the system of accounting, I think is super important and is really the foundation for looking at trade reform.
Thanks very much. Well, now go over to Marcus Lehmann. I mentioned in the opening points that there's a long historic relationship between the WTO and the CBD, but not a perfect alignment between the two. I guess the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property rights is probably a good illustration of that. Marcus, your member states adopted a very ambitious plan in Montreal at COP15 that really calls on governments to put in place action that will turn the current trends around. So in your opening remarks, if you would reflect also on does that bring you onto a collision course with the multilateral trade system? Can it be accommodated within the multilateral trade system, and what sorts of innovations do we need? Over to you, Marcus.
Yes, thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, good time of the day again. Yeah, my pleasure. I will come back to your question, but first of all, I thought I could perhaps, given that first session is about setting the stage, and given that Courtney already mentioned that there is some lack of definition perhaps or conceptualization what the bioeconomy actually is and what the trade relationship then or the trade implications are. I thought I could do some little scoping here, and in fact using the traditional areas of interest in the CBD on trade and the trade system, because I think they're quite useful to highlight the different facets of the bioeconomy in a sense. Before I start, though, I have to flag that unfortunately I have to, as things are these days, I have to leave very soon. My next meeting is at 9, so that will me just give enough time to basically inject some food for thought. But then I would unfortunately have to leave, and wishing you then all the best for the remainder of your work. So let me start. And I think Courtney alluded already to some elements. I mean, if you think about bioeconomy in the CBD context, one of the, perhaps the more traditional areas or areas where work has been undertaken for a long time is the biotrade area. Of course, we know that very well, sponsored by UNCTAD, others like UEBT, etc. So this is ongoing for quite a while, and there has been past work, I do recall very well, to look into trade rules and how they can be supportive of biotrade. And we know that that's not automatically the case, because sometimes it's really traditional products. They do not necessarily need the let's say hygienic, sanitary, phytosanitary requirements of import states that then creates potential obstacles, and those would need to be addressed. So that we have an established stream of work. But of course, as Courtney mentioned, there's other bio-based products, technological innovations that now come to the forefront. And again, those might perhaps not necessarily have trade rules that act as obstacles. But if we say that those are particularly beneficial for biodiversity, you might perhaps think about preferential trade rules. And then, of course, we are with the environmental goods negotiations and the plurilateral efforts that have been recently undertaken. So that, I think, would be one useful stream of work to further explore. Then from the CBD perspective, really central, of course, is biotechnology based on genetic resources, and then the two core concerns addressed by the two protocols under the convention: access and benefit sharing. Courtney mentioned that already, and of course the biosafety considerations addressed by the Cartagena protocol. And yes, I agree that there is this kind of historical link we made, and you will recall that we had intense discussions on the TRIPS-CBD relationship, which is still, I mean, as far as I'm aware, it's still an active item under the Doha agenda, but at least from my perspective, has been rather kind of moved to the back burner, or is a bit like in a dormant stage right now. Would be interesting to learn what the latest thinking there is in the WTO context. Yeah, and then of course there is the major the major third cluster, if you may, and that's how to ensure that trade, and then of course the trade rules do not have detrimental impacts on biodiversity and rather have positive beneficial impacts, right? And this spirit of mutual supportiveness, to use that illustrious term that we had in the past. And then of course, from the CBD perspective, there is the work of the SPS committee and the associated agencies, where we actually had a string of very fruitful collaborations over the past decade, addressing gaps and inconsistencies in the international legal framework related to invasives, and the SPS committee and the SPS division of the WTO Secretariat has been a very active and supportive partner in that collaboration. Similar things apply to the biodiversity, to the biosafety issue. So this is, I think, a particularly important angle if you look at how can, let's say, trade not have, let's say, certain negative impacts on certain drivers of biodiversity loss, and how can we use the established systems, customs, etc., SPS systems, to rather promote synergy with biodiversity objectives. In that context, of course, I mean, I just say this to basically give a polite nod to the colleagues from CITES. That's, of course, a very well-established work. I don't have to tell you, and I'm not sure whether they are at the table. And then, of course, the last major element is really the work on harmful incentives and subsidies. And we know in the Doha agenda, there's both the work on agricultural support, but then also on fisheries subsidies, with the recent breakthrough after a long time of the adoption of the fisheries agreement. And even though we perhaps did not, as we all know, it did not cover all the aspects that we perhaps wished for from the CBD crowd or from the biodiversity crowd. I think that's certainly major progress, and there is a need to basically further promote that. So bottom line, I think we have these, I mean, at least from the CBD perspective, we have these three major clusters or dimensions, perhaps, that would help to kind of indirectly scope what we actually mean when we talk about bioeconomy. So that might perhaps be a useful approach. At least that would be, that was the suggestion I wanted to table at that particular juncture. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. I'm not doing a great job as a timekeeper, so I would ask our last speaker to remember the 5-minute limit. But at least UNEP has been working on these issues actually for a very long time. In fact, some of the original work on the relationship between trade and environment was done by UNEP, who published a series of documents that I think are still probably highly relevant. So UNEP has a long track record here, and very specifically, I think in the last in the last period, you've been working quite a bit on the nature-trade relationship. So perhaps you could offer your thoughts on the trend and what are the key challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. And I will actually keep it to 5 minutes because a lot of my reflections were already covered by the previous speaker. So I'm not going to repeat
Excellent.
that.
Thank you.
But also just to, I mean, I think in this quest of boosting more global bioeconomy, we continue saying, what is bioeconomy and what does it mean? Because it changes between regions, between countries. And we keep seeing that. One thing that I wanted to mention, and it was actually prompted by Julie when she put the context that the global bioeconomy is estimated to be $4 trillion US, and now it could actually grow to 30 trillion. I just wanted to give also the connection with what does it mean for development, because I think it's part of the discussion today as well. And that also means that, for instance, in the EU alone, bioeconomy accounted for 17.5 million jobs annually. So that is an important number. That is actually was employing 88% of the European workforce, and this is expected to increase to 1 million green jobs by 2030. So we start to see that is the finance element, the economic element, but also the development part. And we see as well that these bioeconomies really increasing the complex and globalized value chains. We've been talking about bio-based products, biotechnologies, but equally we see that there is a need that we don't shift the burden. For example, we see it when we want to replace fossil fuel derived supply chains with alternative materials. That could also put stress in other areas like land use, for example. So I think that while we develop this new approach and leaving the status quo, as Caroline was prompting us at the beginning, it's the opportunity also to rethink creating solutions that don't pose another risk or another problem in another area. And we have observed through our work, as Mark said, we have been working quite extensively over the last 5 years at the nexus of nature, positive trade, biodiversity, and sustainable development through this project on the Trade Development and Environment Hub. And we see that the success of our global economy needs to come with the linkages of effective policies that foster the sustainable and responsible use of natural resources, and equally the financial mechanisms to enable that. Our work has been focused a lot in agriculture and smallholders. And as you know, agriculture is the main sector that supports the livelihoods of more than 500 million smallholders worldwide. Many of them are women. And that sector actually feeds 8 billion people globally. But now the demand to fuel that population that could increase to 9.7 billion by 2030 or 2050 is actually increasing the need to produce more and to consume more. So agriculture remains that pillar of bioeconomy. And we also see that, as I started before, what is bioeconomy and what are the strategies that countries are adopting? We found that the International Advisory Council on Global Bioeconomy has actually highlighted some of the strategies that countries are pursuing in terms of bioeconomy. And for instance, Japan, their strategy is harmonizing systems and data and coordinating trade policies with intellectual property and genetic resources. Other countries such as the EU or France or Thailand, they are including in their bioeconomy strategies labeling, certification, and standards for bio-based products. So we see definitely that agriculture is an important sector for bioeconomy, and I'm not covering all of those sectors, but just focusing specifically on agriculture, building on the work that we have done. And it has been already highlighted that 2024 Global Resources Outlook has also said that the global land use that is linked to the loss of biodiversity has occurred mainly in Africa and Latin America. And only 10% of the global economic value generated from these products were received by these countries. So again, it's just an invitation of rethinking how do we create value that also have promote equality. And there's some trends and challenges that we see, and as I said, I'm not going to repeat many of them because, for instance, Marcus already reminded us the work that has been done on repurposing harmful subsidies in agriculture. But equally, what we have been advocating and pushing for is enabling a trade and fiscal policy environment that incentivizes the participation of smallholders in a global trading system. Because a lot of those stakeholders, actually 84% of the 570 million farms that exist in the world are smallholders. And they need that access. And we have done some work in the regions last year in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And some of the key and cross-cutting needs that we have identified to promote a bioeconomy is to improve the access to financing programs for smallholders. Because they simply come down sometimes to, they do not own the title of their land, which completely derails the process for them to access, and therefore the consequences of not having enough resources to shift to other sustainable practices. And I'm going to close here with 2 more points. One is the opportunity on greening the trade policies and agreements. And this should come with providing the technical assistance and the capacity building to the trade partners, but also to help the countries fulfill their ambitions towards a more nature positive trade and net zero trade in this bioeconomy. And the last point is that there's also a need for south to south investments. That's what we have also identified in our work as a trend, because the key source sometimes this is a key source for finance in developing countries, and therefore for the means for them to transfer standards, but also knowledge and the successful business models to deliver this bioeconomy. I'm pausing here. I'm sure there'll be a lot of rich interactions, but hopefully that has contributed to part of this discussion.
It has very much. Thank you, Beatrice. It's I'm glad that you underlined a couple of really important points in this context. One is, of course, the social and economic benefits of green policies, the creation of jobs and livelihoods around the world. The second thing that we mustn't forget is that policies done for the right reasons, if you like, green policies sometimes have unintended consequences that need to be managed and addressed. And thirdly, that although I think we're all fascinated by the bioeconomy, it's an emerging thing and we haven't fully understood its dimensions or how to best pursue it. And of course, we shouldn't assume that a bioeconomy is necessarily nature positive. We have to make sure that it is, but for the moment, there's no guarantee of that. So I think we have, with those three presentations, a very nice little agenda for this first discussion. I would draw the conclusion from the three interventions that we have, if you like, on the one hand, an ongoing agenda of those points that Marcus mentioned that are on the table and that we're trying to progress and have proved difficult, like reforming fisheries subsidies, but that are nevertheless important points at the trade-nature interface that we have to find a way of progressing. The second, of course, is that we're seeing a whole series of new challenges emerging and new opportunities emerging as well. That the size and the rapid growth of the bioeconomy suggests that this is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to, but we should do it with equity very much in mind. That what may wildly benefit the European Union may not wildly benefit Africa. And if we promote systems that benefit one part of the world at the expense of the other, we're going to be in trouble and it will not work. So with that, I'd love to just throw the floor open. Those online, please raise your hands if you want to intervene, and those at the table, well, raise your hands too. Raise your electronic hands if you're online, and feel free to comment on what you've heard in the three presentations, but also to bring forward some of your own ideas. Who wishes to kick off?
I can mention maybe one of the experiences from our side. It's also the work in silos. I think that wasn't mentioned that much because normally you have the training. Sorry.
Something just came on.
So I think that's also some of the issues that we need to see. How do we bring the trade community and the biodiversity community together? Because that's a major topic that happens in the ground. And even if you see the communications here at the WTO level, and sometimes what is happening at the capital level, it's different. And I think that's something that we also need to see how to deal with it.
Thank you. Yes, Marianne.
Hi. Yes, hello, hi, thank you. Mark, I think I would just like to pick up on one of your final points that you made, because it was going on in my mind when I was listening colleagues, which was, we've been asking the question of what is bioeconomy, and we've been concluding that there are different definitions and understandings and what it means for different countries and so forth. But you pointed out that bioeconomy is not necessarily sustainable, and it's also not necessarily biodiversity friendly. And I think that is something really key when we talk about nature positive trade, because it then would need to be positive for the nature through being positive for global biodiversity framework and so forth. So my question perhaps to Courtney, because you talked about the stock take you've done, but also others, is that really reflections on how bioeconomy, what kind of bioeconomy would be indeed nature positive, and what do we know about that already? And I will provide some thoughts, to that regard, when my time comes in the next segment. But one food for thought here, which I and colleagues have been looking into, including colleagues at UNCTAD as well, is looking at elements of circular economy and circularity in bioeconomy, and seeing whether those in conjunction could also make and help to make future bioeconomy more sustainable. So including circular approaches to bioeconomy sectors, regenerative nature approaches, and so forth. So those are sort of my first initial thoughts at this point.
Thanks, Marianne. We'll be hearing from you later, but Courtney, do you want to give a very brief response to Marianne at this point? Courtney? I don't know if you can hear us.
It looks like she's hearing us.
Courtney, can you hear us? No, maybe not. Okay, well then I'll go on to Jean-Yves Remy.
Yes, hello. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you. And thanks for the wonderful opening remarks, which helped to situate some of the discussion. It's going to come as no surprise to anyone here who knows me that I'm going to just add to this discussion point the huge opportunity bioeconomy is for smaller countries. So as usual, we hear about the Africas and the Asias and the Latin America, but there's a huge cohort of countries that are often somewhere on the peripheries of the discussion. I want to put them right in the middle here because of the opportunity to bring peripheral, marginalized economies into the discussion. And these are the SIDS, the small island developing states, the coastal states. This and very important work being done by our colleagues at UNCTAD. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a bio-trade conference that was looking at seaweed as a potential area of opportunity, both conservation, carbon sink opportunities, as well as obviously access to markets and using in a sustainable way the bioeconomy that surrounds these small island states in order to move their targets forward, but also the economic potential forward. And one of the things that I think is so key as we begin to stitch up these different elements of trade, I don't believe in these silos anymore. It's so hard now to even talk about trade in a vacuum. And the way I want to illustrate the point is last week I met up with a local sort of government official who's working in the green and blue economy area. And we were talking about an event that he had actually partnered with UNEP on, looking at blue-green job opportunities. And I was looking at the agenda and it had all the things like job opportunities and industrial policy. And I said to him, why weren't we invited? We're trade people. And he said, the truth is that we don't think of trade as necessarily relevant to this area. And I said, but UNEP, I know UNEP is doing work with the WTO, etc. So part of, I think, the big challenge we have to overcome in our community is to make ourselves relevant and to make sure that people see it no longer as this divide in the way we think about these issues. And some of it is information, some of it is just turning up into these spaces that are much more being grappled with at the domestic level. And that begins with understanding what our own internal departments are doing. So if UNEP is working in the Caribbean with the Caribbean offices, and it's also having this discussion at the WTO, and I'm just using UNEP as an example, this happens in every single government as well as organizational setup, is I think we need to start bringing all these elements together and seeing the intersectionalities and breaking down the silos, because these are huge opportunities for our economies. They're still seeing trade as divorced from the discussion. We've done a lot of work in bringing these areas together, but I just see opportunity here. And I just want to kind of put that front and center as we think forward collaboratively about how we bring all the powers that be and all the bottom-up approaches to be reckoned with and to start having that joint conversation. So that's just my small contribution, and I hope that that is a real game changer in the way we approach these topics. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And it was not a small contribution. It was a very important one because you invited us to look at this through an opportunity lens, not a problem or risk lens. And I think that's important. And secondly, of course, you stress the importance of dialogue, that we still do work in silos much too much, and that maybe one of the contributions we can make is to ensure that that kind of dialogue is multiplied across the interface. Now I'm going to consult with the chair here because I've overrun the time. I have 3 more people. Can I take them quickly?
Yeah, just give everyone a minute.
Can I enjoin you to keep your remarks very short? Thank you.
I'm not sure I was the first raising this, but I will go
first to
very
recognize
quickly. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. Really happy. I forgot to say I was, before joining IUCN, actually I'm seconded at IUCN. I'm seconded by the French government. I've been working 11 years for the French Ministry in charge of environment. And between 2017 and 2021, I was involved in all the negotiations related to the EU, Mercosur, EU, Indonesia, EU, New Zealand, and EU, Australia free trade agreements. So I was deeply involved in these topics. First, I fully join you. Bioeconomy is not a synonym of nature positive. It all depends on, you know, the best key drivers, the direct drivers on biodiversity. We know them: land use change, fragmentation, etc., pollution, climate change, invasive species, etc. So, second, I remember to assess the relationships between trade and the environment. We used to use a theoretical framework, the scale effect. Ricardian, if you push the Ricardian advantages, then the economy grows. It will have a consequence on nature, because per unit of GDP, you have an additional impact on nature if your GDP is growing. The technological effect, and maybe this is where the bioeconomy discussion enters in, and the composition effect. So scale effect, composition effect, and technological effect. I think it's a good grille de lecture or tool to apprehend these relationships. Third, the world has changed a lot. Even the level of openness we have between economies, we are not just after the Second World War today. I think the key issue is how to better align international trade rules, financial system with the global goals and targets we have in the Paris Agreement, for example, and the Kunming-Montreal GBF targets, etc. Very, very interesting examples. The Swiss-Indonesian recently, and it is referred, we have cited it in the background paper. I think this is really interesting to have tariff preferences, tariff conditionalities, depending on the sustainability of product, and I will finish here. Also, an interesting example is in the EU Green Deal, having the Paris Agreement an essential element of a bilateral or regional free trade agreement, meaning if you do not respect what you have committed to, tariff agreements, tariff preferences could be suspended. This is an example of rules that could be replicated elsewhere in the world.
Thank you very much. That merits a much deeper discussion. And of course, I certainly agree with you on the need for alignment and also on the possibility of sort of KPI-linked trade measures. So with that, Christophe, 1 minute.
Yes, very quickly. I mean, just going back on this notion of the bioeconomy is not necessarily nature positive, and we've heard all these big figures of how important the bioeconomy is, but I would suspect that within those figures, actually a huge part of it is not sustainable. I mean, just thinking about fisheries or agriculture, you know, that probably the vast majority is not taking place. So the question to me is really, you know, how do we incentivize or scale up the kind of nature positive part of that sector, and what are the obstacles that we face in scaling up the kind of nature positive segment or part of the bioeconomy? And I think once we have a some understanding of that, so then we can start looking at what is the role of trade and trade policy in this area.
Thanks very much. What we're doing is putting elements of an agenda on the table. I think this is great. Our brains are storming, so this is wonderful. Nice. Last word to you.
Thank you. So just a couple of comments. One, I completely agree with Lorena, and I think several others were saying that we should not be looking at it in silos. So when we talk about bioeconomy, perhaps we also need to link that more broadly to other things that will affect how we deal with the bioeconomy, right? One is, for example, critical minerals. And second is what I call biodiversity sensitive commodities and products. Biodiversity sensitive commodities and products, as distinct from biodiversity sort commodities and products, right? So they're two completely different things. For example, plastics, right? I mean, so we need to talk about those because when it comes to impact, they have to be done with different. And the reason why I'm raising that is because there are a couple of trends I think is going to be extremely important when we talk about the bioeconomy over the next 10, 15 years. One is we know from multilateral agreements and policy initiatives that discussions about having a low emissions development strategy is going to become one of those key drivers for national policy and international policy. Second, we most likely will see over the next 10, 15 years an increasing debate over sustainable consumption and production. I mean, it's not there yet, but it's coming up. And we're seeing that in discussions in UNEP, we're seeing that in discussions in CBD, in the UNEP and others. Which then brings me to, I think, 4 questions perhaps that we need to look at in light of these trends. One is how do we deal with the bioeconomy in terms of looking at natural resource access control and sovereignty issues. And that I think points directly to, I think it was Courtney who pointed it out, you know, this discussion about ABS, access and benefit sharing. This is popping up over and over again in CBD. It's popping up in the pandemic treaty negotiations, which I'm engaged in right now as an advisor. So we need to deal with that. Second, we need to deal with the issue of economic gains for development and poverty reduction and many things. And third, I think we also need to then talk about the issue of the means of implementation. If we want to get everybody on board in terms of talking about the bioeconomy and getting positive opportunities from that, then a key issue that most likely will come up over and over again is not only about opportunities, but about the means of implementation. And that means talking about technology, talking about finance, and the resources to go to it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Vice, and sorry to be so brutal with timekeeping. At this point, we'll turn it back to Carolyn. This has been a very rich harvest already, and in fact, if we structured and organized the many very, very useful points that were made both in the presentations and in the discussion, I think we would have the basis for a fascinating agenda going forward. So, with apologies for running over time, back to you.
No problem, Mark. I think it's really fruitful. I think this whole discussion will blend into one conversation, which is actually good if it flows from one to the others. But I'm going to go straight to the heart of the next section, is really to pick up what some of you have already started dropping into conversation, which is what are some of the options that we have in terms of principles, policies, rules that would help promote this nature positive trade, or as I think Marianne usefully kind of made sure we put in the conversation, a nature positive or a sustainable bioeconomy. And I do think part of that is also removing that which is not sustainable and promoting that which is sustainable. I'm sure you guys will focus on that. I don't think the two that we have 3 people on this panel. We have Aaron, Marianne, and Gabrielle, who's just stepped out for a call, but will come back at 3:30. So she will join us then. So I'll just turn straight to Aaron, and the idea is keep storming with thinking for us. Please go ahead.
I like the storming idea because it removes the pressure on me to be coherent.
Be chaotic.
Let me start with a caveat. I think it was Julie that described this as a group of distinguished experts. I'm not that. I know a little bit about trade and investment. I think everybody around this table probably knows more about bioeconomy than I do. But with that said, with that caveat on the table, let me start by thinking about a framework that we can use to create the kind of a agenda work plan that I think is the object of this meeting. And it starts with understanding what our vision for the future is. We know that the current situation is untenable. What do we actually want in terms of achieving a global economy that's consistent with the principles of bioeconomy? What does that mean in terms of policies that take us from here to there? Once we have that, I think it's a two-step process in thinking about how the trade and investment policies, rules, and institutions either can amplify our quest or frustrate it. And the first is to say what's obstructing us. Well, we've identified the policies we need to get from here to there. We've identified where we want to go and how we want to get there. What in that architecture is obstructing us? What rules in the WTO are obstructing us? So, for example, if we want to think about, I think it was Alyssa that mentioned that the IRP came out with a report with a great emphasis on properly pricing the value of nature and penalizing nature destructive practices. That involves discrimination. It involves discrimination in the favor of biodiversity sensitive products and commodities, which may invoke a need to rethink how we talk about like products in the GATT agreement. All right, currently like products are defined by what we've seen in appellate body decisions, but they are not defined by how a product is produced. We've had some nice appellate body decisions confirming that the exceptions will get us there, but do we need a more fundamental rethink about what like products mean in the WTO that can be sensitive to the need to penalize nature destructive products and reward nature enhancing products. Right? Similarly, if we want to set those prices on their right course, we may need to do some heavy subsidization of practices and products that we like to see. Does that involve a fundamental, are there problems with the subsidies agreement of the WTO? That agreement is currently set up such that it will trip up subsidies which are market distorting, trade distorting, but it is not set up in such a way that it rewards subsidies which take us toward a greater Pareto optimal, social welfare optimal solution, which would involve obviously moving us toward a bioeconomy. Do we need to rethink then the basis for the subsidies agreement and the disciplines that it contains? Similarly, we've touched on the need for the synergy between intellectual property rights rules, the acknowledgement of the value of traditional knowledge and the need for access and benefits sharing. Similarly, we may want at some point to penalize unsustainable investment. I haven't even started talking about investment rules, which are contained in thousands of individual bilateral, regional investment agreements. So much harder to think about how you change those rules or the governance of those. But you get my opinion. You get my drift here. The first step in the process is to think about, after having decided where we want to go, what's obstructing us from getting there, and what needs to change. A footnote to that first step is, if we have decided that something is getting in our way, is there any possible way we can work around that without actually fundamentally changing those rules? And this is a pragmatic consideration because we all know, or I think we know, how difficult it is to get rule changes within an institution that 20 years ago committed to a round of negotiations that has never completed, and from which we have seen very little in the way of multilateral agreement on any kind of rule changes in the past. So to the extent we can, if we found those conflicts and can work around them without reducing the effectiveness of what we've demanded, let's try to do that. The second step is then, after having completed our analysis of what the negative agenda looks like, think about what the positive agenda looks like. How can we harness trade rules, investment rules, institutions, and policies to get us toward our desired ends? And I think we've already heard about some of the positive examples here. fossil fuel subsidies, attempt to get fossil fuel subsidies dealt with in WTO, the quasi-successful attempt to get fisheries subsidies dealt with in WTO. Here, I would also include the need for voluntary sustainability standards, agreed definitions, harmonized metrics that allow us to define what we're trying to get at. Preferential tariffs for environmentally or biodiversity sensitive products and commodities. All of this falls in that basket. Some of it is more difficult than others. If we think about voluntary sustainability standards, that's not as difficult as they are. It is not as difficult as concluding, for example, a fisheries subsidies agreement, which 20 years after it was launched in the WTO has still not been completed to our satisfaction. So the stuff that needs rules, new rules, is more difficult. But anyway, there's this broader agenda then that thinks about the positive agenda by which we can harness trade and investment rules to get to the future we want. Let me close then by coming back to where I started. I sort of said, well, let's figure out what we want and then do this two-step process. The hardest part, in my view, and maybe it's because I'm ignorant of bioeconomy and what it involves, the hardest part, in my view, then is actually figuring out what we want. We've heard already that a bioeconomy is not necessarily nature positive. We've heard that there are various definitions for bioeconomy. We know that replacing fossil fuels may end us up with unintended consequences. This is the homework that we need to do before we can formulate a decent agenda of how to harness trade and investment rules, is to figure out what we want. That's not an insignificant step. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Very, very useful. I'm going to turn next to Marianne. And just before I introduce her, I wanted this to cheer, because one of the things we've talked about today is we have these quite siloed communities. And I think Marianne has really played a key role in trying to bring together the biodiversity and trade perspectives over the past few years, and through also this UNEP project. But this advertising, there's a paper on biodiversity and international trade. It came out a few years ago that Marianne and I co-authored. And then really we're vibing on her work because the next paper was Nature Positive Trade for Sustainable Development, which really looks at how trade and trade policies are relevant to the global biodiversity framework. So just to say, there are 2 resources there for those who are interested in more. Over to you, Marianne.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks also for helping with the introduction and context setting, which I was thinking to do first, which to help people to follow, my intervention here. So indeed, as Carolyn pointed out, in this cooperation with UNEP, TESS, and also other partners who are around the table there, so UNCTAD and WTO, CBD, and also ITC, we worked on the nature positive trade for sustainable development for these past couple of years. And what, among other things that we specifically have done, and what I want to talk about here, is looking at the trade measures, tools, and policies we have, and reflecting those in the light of how they can deliver towards the global biodiversity framework. So that's kind of my starting point here. And I guess linking that then to bioeconomy while you listen, the thesis here would be that I think in order to make bioeconomy moving forward sustainable, we do need to look at bioeconomies and also judge them and evaluate them based on how they deliver towards the global biodiversity framework. So that's the link between the global biodiversity framework and what I'm going to talk about here, and the bioeconomy and bioeconomy strategies moving forward. So basically based on our work, so those publications that Carolyn showed, but also then building on that in cooperation with all these wonderful IGO and also civil society organizations, we've carried out webinars and events on nature positive trade, looking at how it can deliver for global biodiversity framework. So my intervention builds on both of these aspects of it. My first message, and I think it really does build on what's been said before, but maybe crystallizes it, what people have been saying and pointing out, is that the key barrier doesn't really seem to be that we don't have relevant and possible tools to scale up nature positive trade. We do have tools. Countries have tools, they have options, they have possible pathways to follow. And we've heard a number of those tools been already mentioned, by Courtney, but also by others already. The barrier really seems to be more the lack of proactive and coherent use of these tools for biodiversity objectives. And I think, we all know this, but maybe it merits to be really specifically pointed out. And that lack of proactive and coherent use is linked to the lack of political will, lack of visibility of biodiversity in discussions, as you know. And also many people have pointed out to the lack of maybe traditional cooperation between trade and biodiversity and other relevant experts. And of course, that lack of cooperation and those silos have created the situation where we don't really have a vision for the nature positive trade for biodiversity as of yet. And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment. But it's not because of the lack of possible tools we can tap into. And I think that's one of the key messages. There is one of the barriers can also be the lack of consensus on what is sustainable. And that links to what has been discussed here already. And what I also pointed out, that we need to kind of understand better or have a consensus better what we agree is sustainable. And further on that, perhaps in later. But moving forward, in terms of the policies and tools, what we are, I think, realistically looking at is countries adopting different policy mixes for nature positive trade. And I think that's what we should be striving towards. And while countries are doing that, also striving to support cooperation and also transparency between countries. And I think that's also what the final element of today's discussions we're going to be about, which is how we foster that cooperation moving forward. But I think it will be policy mixes by countries towards nature positive trade, and will be interesting to see what those policy mixes look like. One thing we've been advocating and also trying to highlight is countries moving forward hopefully would be using more their national biodiversity strategies and action plans that support the biodiversity convention implementation, the biodiversity plan implementation moving forward, using those NBSAPs more strategically to look at how trade can deliver for biodiversity. As far as I can see and know, and we know none of the countries have been really doing that. Trade features there, here and there, but there is not really a strategic view there. But NBSAPs could be a possible tool, a really good possible tool to create that vision for countries as what they want nature positive trade to look like. And then the NBSAPs could really be used to inform and balance out the bioeconomy strategies and perhaps also the relevant circular economy strategies. Because what we know at the moment is that number of these developments are going forward in countries. They hold a lot of potential, but perhaps what they lack a little bit is synergies between these relevant strategies between one another. So we also know that, for example, countries' circular economy strategies have a lot of bioeconomy elements within them. But do those actually talk to one another? Do they support one another? And do they really look at proactively trade as a delivery tool? And the answer now is not as of yet. So we kind of need the NBSAPs to balance that out and provide that biodiversity vision in there, because I think that is where it would be coming from moving forward. Then final, perhaps slightly more concrete point, I said, the barrier isn't the lack of tools that we could use. We have options, but they really seem to be a bit of a barrier in terms of information. So biodiversity specific information on bioeconomy trade flows, and that's something that UNCTAD is looking at in partnership with others, which is really fantastic moving forward. So how do we get more granular in terms of biodiversity within our nature flows and biodiversity positive trade in the nature trade flows? And then also one other element is that consensus that I already talked about. So consensus as what is sustainable. And through our webinars and our work, we've been asking the question systematically in the context of agriculture, that do we know, or do we have a consensus building at the moment what is internationally considered sustainable agriculture practices, and perhaps as a flip side also non-sustainable agriculture practices. And we've been asking this question from colleagues at CBD who've been following this for a long time. We've been asking this from colleagues at FAO, and the answer we've been getting back is yes, there seems to be material and consensus that internationally is considered sustainable agriculture. It might not be in the right kind of frame for trade people to use as of yet. Maybe that's one of the barriers. Maybe it's not authoritatively enough presented as of yet. So maybe that's something to work on. But I feel that that's maybe one of the things moving forward, the progress that could unlock progress is having more of a consensus around that and broader consensus between the different experts what is considered sustainable agriculture practices, and that more broadly talked about. So maybe that's something concrete to think about as to what, is there working group needed on that, and how to take it forward between IGOs and and so forth, and also civil society actors, and linking it to the finance sector. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Definitely very thought-provoking. As time is short, I'm going to move straight on to Gabrielle. You have the floor.
So good afternoon, everyone. I was moved from the third panel to the second, where the third panel was more in principle, but I think it's a bit the same. What I think I'll do is share 5 or 6 sort of points that may look disconnected, but to me, they're all linked and could improve what the efforts of this meeting. So collaboration, to start with, or cooperation, is mentioned now everywhere since the pandemic. Why? Because there's no solution possible without this collaboration or cooperation, which is not just between countries or organizations, but newly and strongly involving the private sector. So it's a collaboration, horizontal and vertical. And I refer to the MC, the Ministerial Declaration of 22, where even the word stakeholders were mentioned, stakeholders that share responsibility for, like with the WTO, must now be there. Another point is when I started all this, with Erin and those, all of you are more environmental expert than I am. I'm a lawyer. I'm there with my heart, but not necessarily very well informed technically of environment issue, except that I've understood and still do that environment is very much connected to this legal concept of PPM, process and production method, that allows, making distinctions that are not reflected. And not long ago, the EU delegate said that now all their decision is based on PPM. And I'm jumping to a third point. Did you know that the EU notified all its artificial intelligence sort of regulation to the TBT committee, to the WTO, saying this is all a big PPM because it will affect the way goods are done? And everybody was a bit surprised, plus, the expertise and all this. But PPM now is settled in the case law, and it's an hallelujah, where it is legal if you're not protectionist. It's been recognized in the basic GATT provision, in TBT, and etc. So that's good. Why it's important, and I go now to my 4th point, it's because I think that it's too ambitious to hope for harmonization in the context of this meeting or generally environment. It will not be possible. It now starts clashing already between US type regulation.
Pero la última vez que encontré algo era la antigua. ¿No estaba reemplazado online? No, no está reemplazado.
Eugene, can you zap him? Thanks.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, Gabrielle.
So harmonization is a beautiful goal. In WTO, in the context of the hormone dispute, the appellate body at the time said it's a goal, but you should not look at it as an obligation today. Rather, we should go for mutual recognition. And this is why it's important to understand PPM and how things are done, because only then can you say, well, you do it this way because of that problem. I do it completely differently. What is the effect? More economists are needed to understand the effect of those distinctions. Finally, another thing that is true is you've seen at the WTO, the new GSI, these subgroup negotiations that have gone ahead, that are legally not so clear what's the legal basis for these subgroups. The main point is that governments say we need to deal with these problems. We have people who ask us to intervene, so they work. And eventually, the GSI or those subgroups could become stronger, hard law, more multilateral. But this dynamic nature of evolving international law is particularly true, of course, in data, but also in environment and also in what you're dealing now. So I conclude in making a reference, the way I started, to this old TBT committee that was dealing with, harmonizing standard. If you produce toasters and you need to make 65 different plugs, it's a big problem. This is still true. But now in TBT, you have all this artificial intelligence, you have climate change. Have you seen? I wanted to share with you this decision, but I don't know how to share it on the screen. This decision of March 24 at the ministerial on, that's it. Look at the paragraph 2. Include that TBT, very clever, is relevant for all global challenge, including climate, digital, and health pandemic. This committee, if you look at the agenda, is so impressive how it was able to adapt. This is what I call dynamic law, but it's not only law, but it's certainly in evolution. So that's what I was going to share with you in terms of, I hope it's a positive message that the WTO is not a court anymore, because the court is coping with difficulties. It may come back, but it is more than ever a forum of discussion and exchange, and all the environment plurilaterals sort of forum, where Esbeltana and others sort of work, are so wonderful. They put in place what many of you have been saying for years and years, bringing all sorts of actors, talking about all sorts of problems. So alleluia to the TBT, and thank you to those who did these battles for years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. I think one thing that sings between what you said and also what Marianne said was this idea that there are actually tools and policies and processes that harness and are being harnessed, but often it's in a bit of a patchwork fashion, right? I mean, so the question is, how does one elevate that and do it more proactively? I mean, so we tend to go, I mean, I do believe there are rules that may need to be changed, but there are also rules that we have that we're not using as well as we could. There are policies and tools that we have that governments could use, they could cooperate on, they could do things. So there's part of this discussion is also just about how does one elevate the importance of nature in these discussions, that this is worth doing or necessary to do as well. So the floor is open for reflections. We had 3.
And if I may just add something to support you, it's what you said, but I would say more strongly, and thanks to the Appellate Body, it's how you read old terms. So remember what the Appellate Body said, the reference to sustainable development and the preamble force you to have a new reading, texture, dimension, whatever, of old terms, 70-year-old. So yes, we need new rules, but we also need to read things differently. And that's less of a burden. Yeah.
Super. I have Mark ready and Svetlana, Vice, Christoph. So you've inspired us. Fantastic. Thank you very much for our thoughts, Steiners.
Well, thanks.
So Mark, we've got half an hour.
Thanks to all the speakers. That was a very, very interesting set of presentations. I'd like to go back to Aaron's axiom, which is essentially, if what you're trying to do is to adopt new rules or to change existing rules, you're up against a very serious challenge, but there are a lot of things you can do short of that. Agreed definition. We ran through them, but what Gabrielle has also reminded us that the actual functioning, the day-to-day functioning of the WTO offers a lot of opportunities. The committee, the PDP committee, presumably the GSM committee as well. In other words, that your first best option is to see whether there's a way within the rules you're trying to do. The second is to work through the existing procedures, and only third, I think, call for rule change. And I'm not saying that isn't in the end necessary, maybe, but it certainly shouldn't be what one starts with, because then you just go head on against a massive juggernaut.
Thank you, Mark. Just before I turn to the next speaker, I just wanted to note that we've been joined by Gavin Edwards, who's the Executive Director. Can you just wave, Gavin, if you're there, or put on your camera so that we know you are there? He's the Executive Director of Nature Positive Initiative. There he is, in the park. Fantastic.
Hi, yeah. Thank you. In there, well, in the middle of Brussels, just running between meetings, so apologies for joining very late. But yeah, quick introduction. So, would you like me to give an introduction now, or?
Maybe just when you take the floor a bit later. I'll just because I've got the cue. But say I love the fact that you're found nature in the middle of Brussels and it's not a fake painting behind you. And Chantal, you also joined us and didn't have a chance to introduce.
Hi everyone, sorry, I'm in Paris for the impact measure event on similar issues. Looking forward to meet you all back in Geneva.
Super, thank you, Chantal. Okay, I'll go back to my order. I think it was, let's go Vice, Antoine, Christophe, and then I can go to Peter, and I guess Gavin.
No, next to you.
I'm right to you first. Go ahead. Sorry, you go first.
Thanks. Well, first to say it's difficult to speak after Gabriela when she already said very, very important things about what we do at the WTO. Just to continue a little bit on the same theme of discussion that also Mark highlights about changing the rules or using what we already have. And I think there is an important mindset that's changing in the WTO, and I just wanted to highlight that. Some years before, it was very difficult to have any conversation related to trade and environment. A lot of developing countries simply would block the agenda. They would not want to have this conversation. Now this is not the case. And I think that's very positive because more and more developing countries want to participate in the conversation. And as many people highlighted today, these are actually the countries that we want to discuss with. And that makes it very important actually to have a discussion on biodiversity at the WTO. Now, the bad news is perhaps we don't have a specific forum that discussions like the JSI, like environmental initiatives for biodiversity, have the time to think about for the future. The good news is that, as many people highlighted, in a lot of communities, this is already happening. What I wanted to add to that is that the 3 environmental initiatives that we have, even though neither of them directly has spoken yet about biodiversity, a lot of them actually tackle questions that are very, very relevant to economy and biodiversity. And here I'm not going to enter into much detail, but I'll say thank you to Marianne because she did conduct a series of webinars that gave us the opportunity to touch upon these issues and how, let's say, at the TESS, the Trade and Environment and Sustainability Structure discussions, all of their working groups that talk about designs of subsidies, about circular economy, about environmental goods and services, how these aspects touch upon biodiversity, and how hopefully the members would like to take it to the next step then start specifically dealing with how the bioeconomy can be nature positive, as everybody said. Other things that we are talking and members are doing, for instance, last year, we conducted this forum on decarbonization standards in the steel sector. Why not start talking about decarbonization and about nature positive in this kind of on the topic of standards in other sectors that relate to the bioeconomy? That's another idea. And yeah, finally, the CT, the forum where actually all members are present, because in these initiatives, it's not everybody on the table, right? There's also a little bit of a reform that's ongoing. Members are organizing thematic sessions. We are hoping that there's going to be more support to organize thematic session on biodiversity. And there are also more intense discussions. For instance, there is a proposal, let's have specific discussions on the designs of carbon pricing mechanisms and CBAM type of measures. So a lot is happening and there is a lot of potential and we are hoping to see more biodiversity come.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. I think it was next. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just wanted to share sort of like the conversation we had in Indonesia about a month ago with the Forest Agriculture Commodity Trade Dialogue, because when I was listening to to colleagues talking about the fact that there are already tools out there, for example, what does sustainable agriculture mean? what Gabriel was talking about in terms of maybe the need for us to look more pragmatically into what we can do. We did try that experiment in the dialogue. The dialogue, in case you don't know what it is, it's a group of 20, I think almost 30 developed and developing countries, producer and consumer countries of commodities. We were mandated, when I was in the Secretariat, we were mandated to do a study that would look at different sustainability initiatives in beef, cocoa, palm oil, and timber. And so we looked at different criteria, and then we eventually came up with an initial list of environmental criteria only. We got pushback from our developed country members because it said sustainability is not about environment only. And I think that's one of the first key things that we need to talk about, right? To highlight that, sustainability in itself has elements of economic, social aspects to it as well. So as the Secretariat, we expanded the study, and we then looked at environmental, social, and economic criteria. And then in comes a bunch of other countries. Surprisingly, both, I think it was Canada and Brazil, who then said, well, you also need to look at the political/legal aspect of sustainability. So I said, okay, expanded the study, 4 sets. So when we had the forum, the senior officials meeting in Indonesia a month ago, the Secretariat presented the study, and one of the recommendations we put forward was, perhaps member governments could start looking at it and see if we could think about harmonization. And there was a huge debate. I think we had slotted like 3 hours for that, and we ended up occupying almost one entire day of the calendar, because there was pushback against the idea of harmonization. I completely agree with Gabriel about that. But the idea then was, if it's not harmonization, what do you do then? How do you come up with a set of sustainability criteria that takes into account environment, social, economic, and political/legal criteria in a way that makes participants, regardless of development circumstance and all that. And so one of the, I think, ideas that got people nodding was this idea of mutual recognition, and perhaps that is one of those things that we might want to look into. In case you want to know what the criteria were that we eventually ended up looking at, we had 8 environmental criteria running from ecosystem preservation to climate change mitigation adaptation, water conservation, and soil management. Social criteria were on workers' rights and human rights. Economic criteria were on livelihood and economic diversification and access to credit and investment and financing. And then the legality criteria were on legal compliance, participation in policy, and those were things that in the study came up most frequently in all of the sustainability initiatives in the beef, cocoa, palm oil, and timber sectors. And when we rolled it out to the senior officials who were there at the meeting, they struck some off. They said, some make sense, some do not really make sense. But the idea of, trying to gravitate around a certain set of criteria that you can then use to define that this product or this commodity is sustainably produced, was gravitating towards the idea of maybe we have some kind of mutual recognition arrangement, right? Very pragmatic, not norm setting, not norm making, among different governments that would be involved in that. And then second, match that kind of mutual recognition arrangement with some kind of technical assistance / finance / technology transfer support mechanism. So as to assuage concerns from those that are less able to, who feel that they are less able to meet that criteria, that they would actually be equipped to do so, and therefore not lose out from any possible opportunities or gains from trade. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Vice, for sharing that. One of the things that's so perplexing in this discussion is there are so many discussions happening in different fora, with slightly different configurations of play. As I remember last year, we asked Vice to come and talk to some of the agriculture and trade negotiators here. Many of them had never heard of the fact dialogue that their own environment ministries were involved in. But that's really interesting because it does involve, I think, at the beginning, but it's 40 producer and consumer countries, right?
30.
30. So still, it's a significant, because it's really the main players. And I'm going to slightly shift the order to Aaron and Christoph, just because I would like to turn to Gavin and Peter, who haven't spoken yet. So I'll turn back to you, Gavin, and then to Peter.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, quick introductions. Yeah, I'm Gavin Edwards with the Nature Positive Initiative. The Nature Positive Initiative is a grouping of 27 organizations, conservation organizations, business platforms, and others such as Indigenous perspectives that are coming together around the use of the term nature positive, which of course is echoing all through this meeting and through the wider discussion that's happening here, which is fantastic. And also the metrics and measurability around nature positive as well. Nature positive is a term that was defined a few years ago and has grown up and has grown into a common narrative, a common shorthand or mainstreaming way of referring to the Global Biodiversity Framework's mission to halt and reverse nature loss, biodiversity loss. That narrative has taken off well in many different circles. We're seeing everyone from MDBs embracing what the nature positive funding flows might look like multilaterally, to companies, to auditors, grappling with how you might actually look at it from a specific perspective. We're seeing governments such as the Australian government right now putting a nature repair market in place and the definition of nature positive as well. So it's growing in a narrative term. The challenge and the next big challenge, and the challenge that we will all be facing, and is something that's very central to this conversation today, is how do you measure whether nature is in decline or in restoration at any given place, whether that's a site level, an ecosystem level, a company supply chain, a national level, or a global level. And so over the next few months, we're going to be designing and running a process to narrow in on measurement and metrics. We're in a situation now where we've never had as much measurement of the world, whether it's counting species or the evolution in GIS mapping and satellite data, or new technologies such as eDNA or acoustic listening to understanding nature and wildlife populations. And yet there's no single consensus on a common set of metrics and approaches to measuring nature in decline or in recovery. And so that's the consensus that we're going to try to attempt to build over the next few months. And if we can pull together a consensus around this, it will have a system-wide knock-on effect, whether it's for the financial system that is already looking at disclosure in relation to nature, whether it's the real economy that's looking at applying science-based targets for nature, and also coming to the trade perspective that we're covering today. So my last point is just really encouraged to hear the conversation today. I'm more from the nature side, not the trade side. So I love it when communities like this come together in different ways and different perspectives come together. We're already seeing some small progress. There was a reference earlier on fisheries subsidies, a very difficult and intractable issue, but an essential issue that some progress has been made on. And of course, there is a global biodiversity framework, multilateral commitment on subsidies within the global biodiversity framework as well, which we hope should open more doors, and that will also come back to trade issues as well, we're sure. So we're really looking forward to joining this conversation, seeing how we can help and contribute, and also echoing your conversation in other rooms as well that are grappling with the transition that we need so that we can see that we would have more nature in the world in 2030 than we had in 2020, which is the essence of the definition of nature positive. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and also really great to have you here. One of the things that I think is really valuable about this meeting is trying to bring together some of the different actors in this arena, because in the trade arena, it's quite a heavy lift to get people to focus on biodiversity and nature. But out there in the world, in the financial world, in the environmental community, and so on, and in the private sector, I think there's tremendous engagement and dynamism going on, and in many of the, so part of it is connecting that together and bringing that dynamism and showing what's possible. So it's useful, very useful to have you here today. So thank you. I'm going to turn to Peter, please. He's going to bring another perspective to the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. A bit like Gavin, I'll continue that slight veering off from the somewhat policy and legally dense conversation that was unfolding and was interesting, but quite removed from what I usually engage with. To introduce myself in a bit more depth than during the introductory remarks, I also have a couple of hats. One of them is I am an organic apple producer myself. I have a small enterprise in Denmark where I'm currently seated. The weather is not quite as nice as in Brussels, but we're catching up with you. But I think the capacity in which I was invited is as an impact investor or an impact investment manager with the Common Fund for Commodities. We're in an impact fund based out of Amsterdam. We were established as part of an UNEP program, the Integrated Program on Commodities. Today, we invest into agri-SMEs across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, with historically a smallholder focus, but increasingly also an environmental focus, which we consider in terms of biodiversity and climate primarily. And yeah, I'll try to bring that financiers and agri-SME perspective into the discussion, as at least for an interlude until you continue. So I'll start off with a short anecdote. I in February attended the World Cocoa Foundation annual gathering and Cocoa fair, one of the biggest chocolate maker fairs in Amsterdam. And one of the sessions that I attended was between cocoa exporters in West Africa and an EU representative. And that was a vicious sight. There was one policymaker there who was really thrown to the lions. And the sentiment among the cocoa exporting countries, as the discussion focused on the EU deforestation regulation, was rightfully on that cost of transitioning that it implies for them and the great uncertainty that they were facing at the moment. This is a piece of regulation which will hopefully result in everything that we're seeking to achieve in terms of limiting deforestation, but it does come at quite some heavy cost, not simply in terms of transforming production methods, because we're not really in West Africa talking about a lot of deforestation-led cocoa growth. Most of that deforestation took place way before the time frame that the EUDI is focusing on, but simply the cost of monitoring and complying with the requirements that are being put in place. And there were some remarks from the EU representative that, well, there were certain programs. I think she quoted a $30 million program in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, to help with that transitioning and meeting those reporting requirements. But really, the $30 million for ensuring that an economy, West African economy, cocoa economy, can meet those reporting requirements is like a drop in the ocean. And to me, it kind of highlights that the cost sharing element when it comes to the implementation of these programs, even if it seems like a relatively minor issue of sharing information, will be significant, not only for the purpose of deforestation, but for similar programs in the future, if we're looking at this type of restricting certain types of trade, where there's primarily also a downside to these economies. So it's only natural for them to be quite skeptical when they're being brought forward, unless, of course, there is a significant chunk of cost sharing involved. Now, that's looking at the downside cases where we restrict trade. We're looking to achieve certain positive environmental goals, but to those whose livelihoods depend on them, and that's not only the government officials that were present at the fair, but the smallholders that they represent and who we're concerned with as impact investors. What we also need to look at is, as it's being put also in the title of the session, how can we positively incentivize this sustainable and nature positive trade? And to us, that's really also as investors, by looking at trading these financial upsides rather than introducing uncertainties by imposing restrictions. And one of our investees, also a cocoa producer out of Colombia, well, she's been taking in approaching the EUDI a really optimistic approach, saying, well, actually, this is going to put in place a number of technologies that will allow us to report on those nature positive effects and impacts that our activities have locally, and that may allow us to eventually generate a premium by selling marketing these positive effects to the companies that we're exporting our goods to. However, we could have also maybe taken the EUDI as the blueprint for how to have achieved this in the first instance. Maybe the EUDI should have not been used as a negative screening device for what products could have entered the EU, but being used as a set of technologies and principles by which we could classify what is deforestation free and what can be labeled as deforestation free when products come into the EU. That's an investment case for financiers such as us. We can go and invest into companies that can deliver deforestation-free products and receive a premium for them when they export them, as well as it is for the governments. So those were my 2 cents, especially when it comes to restricting trade and imposing downsides. There is a need for cost sharing, and maybe the positive story and the buy-in that we need for this from the governments and from the smallholders who we're also looking to include in this, as Beatrice said. We need to look at creating opportunities, upsides, investment cases. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Peter. Your remarks reminded me of something in a declaration on global environmental challenges that 70 developing countries issued at MC13. We felt this is a really significant statement because it was a really an effort by developing countries to shift the narrative and say, it's not that we are not interested in these topics. We accept that there are global environmental challenges. We are involved in trying to tackle them. Here's the way in which we would like to approach these topics. We have some concern. But I mention it, Peter, because they specifically had a paragraph in there saying they would like to have a discussion on positive incentives for sustainably produced products that would enable them to have an upside to this whole discussion in the face of feeling like they're only getting the downside to it. And I think that paragraph is something it was a huge lift and significant that, and if you look at the signatories to that statement, that they said that in the declaration. So I thought it's something that goes to your line, and we hear it we're also the secretary for the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate, and there again, it's the developing country members who are saying we would like to have positive incentives for how we can do this, and you know, I think linking that, and also they want to link it to the finance discussion because they say most of the things they want to do will rely on access to adequate financing, either government or private sector at reasonable rates, and that will support them, and it's to do with contracting arrangements and all of those things. But I think somehow we have to link that trade policy side with the very practical side of the finance world as well, which is why it's great to have NatureFinance here today as well in this conversation. I'm going to just turn quickly to we've got 5 more minutes to keep us on time for these sessions. I'm going to turn to Antonin, sorry, and then Cookie and Christophe, and in a second, Marianne, I saw that you wrote a question in the chat. I'm going to ask that to Bite in a second as well.
Very quickly. Thank you very much. I would like to rebound on Aaron, Gabrielle, and Marianne statements earlier made. So I'm afraid there is not a single definition of, for example, of what is sustainable agriculture. We experience this in every TESS and CBD COP, for example. You have countries defending the sustainable intensification approach, relying on land sparing approach. You want to increase the yield to spare land. On the contrary, you have the agroecological approach, where you want to put more nature in the cultivated fields. These are almost polar approaches to what is sustainable agriculture and FAO, and this is normal because it reflects the agro-ecosystem context of regions of the world. It's normal. We will never reach, I think, a consensus. Starting from here and rebounding on what you said, Aaron, who is the we when you were saying what do we want? We should clarify our vision. I think who is the we? I think we should take advantage of having agreements already adopted, long-lasted, negotiated and discussed, such as Paris Agreement for mitigation and adaptation, and such as the Kunming-Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework. We have this now on Marianne. Why not suggesting that each country updating its NBSA should add a section on, according to the national context, what's the vision to have a better alignment between the trade agreements this country is involved with and biodiversity and climate-related targets this country is trying to reach. This would allow us to have a vision of the visions of many countries, sort of bottom-up approach. And maybe we would realize there are common aspects of not harmonization, not a pure consensus, but at least a clarification of possible coalition of countries looking for the same reforms in the international trade rules. And at the same time, since the TBT is so reactive at WTO, maybe we could expect from WTO TBT to be more proactive. And this is rebounding on one of the paragraphs of the paper that Caroline and Mark have redacted prior to this discussion. And just this is a key priority and expectation. So having WTO being more proactive and clarifying ways how PMPs could be better articulated with tariff preferences. PPMs could be better articulated with tariff preferences. What I experienced in France is that some countries within the EU are self-inhibiting. They don't want to be creative because they are fearing a dispute at WTO. So having guidance from WTO showing that there is a pathway to better articulate PPMs with tariff preferences when negotiating a free trade agreement could help.
Excellent. Thank you, Antonio. Tuki and then Christoph.
Okay, so having listened, I have more of a question for everybody. And there's 2 points. I actually worked as an economist with DG Sanko many years ago. And one of the key things that we were working on was kind of food, importing food to EU, and a lot of the importing countries not understanding why the EU was mandating all these phytosanitary requirements. And one of the things we did was actually to have a stakeholder meeting, inviting the experts, the farmers, the supermarkets, some of the lobby and the corporates, environmental NGOs, to try and actually put them together in the room and to try and explain why it needed to be this way. And what really created was kind of a dialogue and an understanding from different actors. Okay, so they're not just trying to kind of stop trade from our part, talking about the cocoa farmer. So kind of having the conversation, understanding the pressure that more of supermarkets wants. So explaining the dynamics really helped understanding of what the rules were and why they were there. And I think even just that really helped. So I think bringing people together from the different, the environment, the trade, and the finance sector would be, I think, important. What I'm missing here is kind of talking about the inequality aspect of it. So when we talk about trade and environment, it has an impact on jobs and so on, and it will have different impact even within a country. I was talking to somebody about the new EU rule, actually, about the polluter pays in terms of plastic. So the impact it has on small micro businesses having to register in each EU country to be able to ship on e-commerce, for instance, has a very different implication than if you're a big corporate, you're actually having to register and pay for your basically your carton, your plastic. So it is having a huge impact on small businesses, which are mostly actually run by women, as opposed to big multinationals. So I think we also need to look into what is the impact within countries as well, and not just kind of more general. And I think the main question I had is, if we're thinking we want to have a low carbon sustainable economy, as we've defined it with the SDGs, I haven't heard about the SDGs and the KPIs. Are they things that we can also incorporate along with the CBDs and the Paris Agreement and so on? Do we need a new system, or are we okay with just using what's existing and then maybe focusing on the kind of mutually recognition? Because what I'm thinking about is, like, if we look at the digital economy now, it's totally different, but governments are now kind of running behind, trying to catch up with new regulations, how to regulate social media, how to regulate the harm. It's kind of like working after the situation has happened. So is there room to think about, okay, what kind of trade system do we need in order to be, you know, I don't know, by 2050, climate neutral global economy? I'm just wanting to ask here, do we need a new system, or need to adapt it, or is it more kind of the hodgepodge that question than an answer, really?
Yeah, no, but all very good questions. I think it also sings a little bit with what Beatrice was saying earlier, also around thinking about smallholders as opposed to big agricultural sort of supply chain leaders as well. That you have this in other aspects of the, you know, that are relevant to nature positive trade as well in different sectors, where you're going to have MSMEs and there are different issues about their capacity to comply and participate. But also, one of the things I know the head of the ITC is always saying, that these are some of the companies that are also the most innovative in terms of sustainability as well, are often the MSMEs. So there's another issue with that as well. Christoph, quickly, and then we should close this and move to the cooperation part, which we're leading towards naturally.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to go back also to some of the points that Aaron made at the beginning, and I think the way I understood it, at least, he made a very interesting distinction between what are the issues. One thing is the extent to which the rules, the system as it is, prevents countries from doing the right things, basically. That's one set of issues. And then there's another set of issues, which is, can we transform the system so that it actively contributes to doing the right thing, right? And that's where the fishery examples. In the first case, it seems to me that Gabriel told us that there's a lot of way in which the rules are being interpreted, their flexibility, and increasingly, I think there's a sense that you can actually do quite a lot of things. My concern with that is that these tends to be kind of unilateral measures, individual measures taken by different countries. Whereas in the second categories of things, we're more looking at how together can we cooperate to address an environmental problem. So I tend to like more the second one but both are exceedingly difficult, and particularly the second one, because it goes back to, I think, the point that Kevin and others were making is, do we have a consensus of, what type of trade should be either prohibited or should be promoted? And we see that every day. What are problematic plastics? Do we have a consensus on that? What are good agriculture practices or bad agriculture practices if we want to get rid of environmentally harmful subsidies in agriculture? What is that? Do we have a consensus on that? And to me, that's really what it's the main stumbling block that prevents us from moving in the right direction. I think even if you look at the fisheries agreement, which can be seen as a success, it was exceedingly difficult to agree on basic things. What is an overfished stock? And that's supposedly an area where there's sufficiently scientific consensus. What is a stock maintained at biological sustainable level? Who defines that? And that's why this whole issue of metrics, this issue of definitions, this issue of methodologies is to me really one of the key challenges that we're facing.
Can I cheat and say 10 seconds?
Yes.
Yes, there is unilateral, second best in CBAM and all that, and there's a perfect multilateral, but you have this new animal, the structured discussions, where you have 130 countries. It's not just unilateral. It's a decent number who's trying.
Yeah, super. One of the things, so I'm going to close this discussion and move us into part 3, which is really focused around what are the options for enhanced cooperation. I mean, we're looking at that already. One of the things I was thinking earlier, Marianne had mentioned the national, I'm going to get the acronyms wrong, the National Biodiversity Strategies, NBSAP, sorry.
NBSAP.
And it reminds me also of course, in the climate context, you have the national NDC plans and so on. And it's interesting because one of the things the trade community is trying is, well, how can trade be a tool, or how do you need to better manage it in the context of these national strategies? But one of the challenges I find with that is then it becomes siloed, right? We're fragmenting into all of these national plans. How are you going to use trade policy or trade measures when, if that trade is always with someone? So it's always about, how do you build the cooperative relationships you need, recognizing one, someone's consuming, someone's producing. Countries probably don't want to not consume that thing. They just want to consume something that's better produced or on fairer terms, whatever it is. So the question is, how do you build that relationship where instead of, I actually was in an interesting conversation yesterday with a European advocate, and I was surprised because he started to say, we're doing a lot of work around the environmental footprint about imports, which is important to understand and take responsibility for it. But usually it leads to, and therefore why we shouldn't have them. And he said, well, the whole idea of doing this is instead they want to frame it that the reality is we depend on these imports. We want to import these things. So, but recognizing that they have a footprint, what can we do to take responsibility for helping the country address that so they can still export to us? Which is a different frame somehow to, I think, to the usual one. And I thought that was very useful. So I think it's in this part of the discussion, I think what we need to shift to is a little bit, what can we do recognizing that there is a need to lift this issue up? There is an environmental dimension here that is critically important. We need more nature positive production and trade. But how do we do that in a way that is also fair and in which we can get some international cooperation around? Because if it's not fair, we won't get the international cooperation. We'll get fragmentation instead. So, and how do we, so that's the question at hand. I have Chantaline first, who can take the first stab at this, and then Vice, and then hopefully we'll still have a good sort of 20 minutes to hear reflections from others. Chantaline, are you still with us?
I'm here.
Yeah, super, excellent. Over to you.
Hi, Caroline, and hi, everyone. I think like all my friends are in Geneva when I step out. Next time we'll try to plan better. So basically, we're so happy that you could organize this event, Caroline, and with NatureFinance and others. As you know, we've been reaching out to many of you to try to help us define the way forward. UNCTAD has been doing trade and biodiversity for 25 years, more than 25 years, actually, and trying to actually, through the criteria and principle of biotrade, to advance nature positive solution by providing sustainable livelihood to communities, for giving them an incentive to actually preserve biodiversity. And it involved the criteria that have been developed, such as benefit sharing, such as sustainable use and prior consent and others of the CBD, which terms like bioeconomy, which now we have all these beautiful terms coming out, do not have definition. So we have to be very careful. And then I think it was Aaron that mentioned, what is it that we want? And do we want a broader term that brings everything in, but then leaves a risk of including everything, and therefore the impact on biodiversity, which are already tenuous and hard to document now, even harder to do so. And we're already working with 80 countries on biotrade. And should we try to, exactly for several of the points have been made earlier, try to get more companies and government through their procurement policy to acknowledge and take advantage of biotrade and use those as a means to have nature positive. And so that is the expansion of the others, or do we substitute biotrade into the bioeconomy? I think these are the type of questions we need to ask ourselves. And then as I come, and I'm not that new anymore, and I come to this head of the trade, environment, climate change, and sustainable development. This biotrade work is and we're trying to see what should be the next phase of this trade and biodiversity work. I really think, and of course, you know, I might have to disclose that Aaron is my dear friend. So, but I agree with his comment. You know, how do we address this discrimination thing? Do we embrace it? That now is yay, PPM are accepted everywhere, and therefore let's you know jump on it and then see how we could make the best out of it, or are we trying to see and this of course I'm being facetious here because UNCTAD will do both, but document the potential impact on developing countries, and then same with subsidies. How do we ensure they're enhancing biodiversity? And the other, I think somebody, I can't see because it's too small, mentioned also circular economy and plastic substitute. So I'm wondering, what do you see? And then I'm being very selfish, since my understanding is that originally the idea for this meeting was for helping NatureFinance help us and others on our next venture going forward. What do you see the role of UNCTAD in trying to help define what is it that is needed? Do we embrace this bioeconomy and then subsidize biotrade, or do we say biotrade should be the key because it has principle, and then we subsidize the other nature capital? And then how do we finance that and have the trade and investment means of implementation to achieve it and scale it? I don't know, but I think I'm sorry, I'm not proposing solution, but I'm posing question here, and we're very open to your answers. And I see this more as a brainstorming as opposed to, you know, one of us as the key answer. I think I will stop here, except for the fact that, you know, the biotrade principle are recognized as the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Principle, one of the indicators, sorry. So this is already recognized, so that's one of the advantage. And also, I think Marianne and Carolyn mentioned the NBSAP and the NDCs. So we're proposing at UNCTAD with ITC, with our Division on Investment and Arts and Trade, that we develop the means of implementation and the protocol for the NDC 3.0 for next year for countries, especially developing countries, so they have the means of implementation to have the ambition of a 1.5 aligned NDCs, because right now it's not happening. And basically, I think our countries have made it clear that they're not the one that's going to be supporting them to achieve that. So they need to find those means of implementation. And my question, final question, promise, Carolyn, is how do we build the synergies in these NDCs with biodiversity, which is very faint right now? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Chantaline. So just before going to Vice, for those of you who are online, Marianne just posted in the UNCTAD's biotrade principles in there. And she had also asked a question earlier to Vice about whether and when the criteria that you discussed in the fact dialogue will be public, because she thought that could be a useful report. Yeah. Can you just answer that super quickly?
Well, that depends on the governments. We don't know yet. We didn't get agreement on that.
Not yet.
It will be published.
Okay.
Anyway,
okay.
But I can circulate some of that.
Okay, excellent. I mean, that also is one of the challenges here, isn't it? You sort of have ISO, various scattered standards on this and that. Different bodies put out different recommendations and standards, and criteria and things like that. But it's sort of, but then people are not necessarily aware of those in different settings. Sure, the business sector, as you mentioned, Peter, has also tools that it's producing. So the investment sector. Yes.
Could I just say one more thing, and that's important, is the measurement, right? Since I'm at this impact measurement conference, I have to say that we've also started a trade and biodiversity statistical working group to actually try to identify with all the UN agencies and national statistical offices and all the key stakeholders, so that we can actually measure. And then it makes it easier first to socialize the impact, and second to finance it. Over. Thank you.
Excellent, super Chantaline. So I don't know if Gavin is still listening, but we should put you in contact with him because he was just mentioning earlier that the new Nature Positive initiative, which he leads and which Marco Lambertini, I think, is the former head of WWF, so it's also on measuring the biodiversity impacts. So there may be some synergy there. Sorry?
I think they're members. We have 88 members, the working group. I think
they're members of that.
Let me double check.
I wasn't sure it was this UN agency. So
No,
anyway,
yeah.
super. That sounds fantastic. Okay.
Let me double check.
So over to Vice, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So just thanks for these talk starters. I really don't know what to say, but there are 4 points that I thought might be useful to start us off on this. One is, I think, when we talk about this topic of possible options for enhanced cooperation, one is it seems to be pretty clear that there needs to be a trust building exercise undertaken across the board on many of these issues, largely because I think there are 2 trends that seem to be happening. One is a trend of increasing suspicion with respect to the unilateral measures that are being imposed. For example, the EUDR, CBAMs. But at the same time, there is this opposing, I don't know if it's trend, but opposing approach of more and more countries, including developing countries, actually saying trade, environment, sustainability, and climate change interlinkages are actually important to talk about. So how do you map those 2 sort of like diverging, discussions going on? One of suspicion over the rationale for some of the measures that are being put in place in the name of climate change or sustainability, but at the same time you have more and more countries actually saying, yeah, we need to talk. So you need to have that kind of trust building exercise, which means that, which is also a reflection of, I think, broader geopolitical or geoeconomic tensions that we also need to deal with. Second is no vilification. I think maybe part of the trust building exercise is to sort of like highlight the fact, or perhaps the positioning that countries, when they talk about certain positions or perspectives over what they see to be the appropriate linkage or the appropriate approach, it's not because they don't want the issue, but more because they're looking at it from a perspective that makes sense to them. And therefore, it will not make sense to some others, but it is no excuse to vilify or think of those others as villains. So the second one then is change in narrative framing. And I think what you pointed out, Caroline, this experience from I think you said a European activist of some sort, right? That kind of framing is going to be extremely useful when you talk about cooperation. There's this framing of what can we do to help move things along better, rather than sort of like a framing of this is what we want to do, and then the other side then hears it as saying, are you telling us that we have to follow what you're telling us? You get it. Third is then what would be the international cooperation elements that maybe we could highlight. I think there are several elements to that. One is this issue of access and benefit sharing that Courtney first raised. That is quite important when you talk about biodiversity and bioeconomy. Second, this issue of means of implementation. So that means really talking about the finance aspect and the technology transfer aspect. Because that's only when you are able to say, as part of your narrative framing, I think, that you don't need to worry that you will be we will be lifting all boats together at the same time, because there will be support coming in to help us deal with the possible downsides of this transition that we're trying to look for. That then you can actually build trust. So it's sort of like a circular economy type approach, if you will. Maybe let me end there. Thanks.
Super. Thank you very much, Vice. So the floor is open for reflection. Chantaline put some pointed questions about what does this mean for the work of this issue of bioeconomy and mean for ongoing work on biotrade. I just also, Marianne also put in the chat information about the biodiversity and trade group. So my bad for not understanding that it already did involve non-UN stakeholders and experts could also be involved in that. So I assume, yeah.
Yeah, maybe if I just complement. So the working group, we already have 3 meetings in the working group. We have a UTN also. It's around 88 experts, including staffs, biodiversity experts, co-chairs of the SAPTA meeting of the CBD. And the first meeting, we map databases. So we have around 36 databases that are working on trade and biodiversity. The latest one was the WTO one. The second meeting, we discussed on the priorities and the scope. So what is a biodiversity-based product and what is not? What is the scope of the study? The next meeting next week, we will be discussing about indicators for sustainability and indicators for trade. So it's really, we hope to come up with a proposal. So the thing is moving forward and everybody is really invited to join. And I think that can also contribute a lot to the work.
Thank you. And also, just before I turn to others, one of the challenges we found in writing the background paper and preparing for this meeting is it's such a huge scope, right? There's biodiversity-based products that are bad for biodiversity. There's bioeconomy, which is so much broader than bio-based or biodiversity-based products, because all of the natural resource extraction is part of the nature economy, I guess, broadly speaking. It's using nature. So we found it quite confusing in the end to know exactly how to use the different terms and terminology in this space. But I don't think it's obvious to say. But Beatrice and then Aaron. And then I also want to check Courtney, because you have been listening attentively, or Julie, if you want to come in this part as well. But I'll turn to Beatrice. Yeah.
I just wanted to share some of the experiences that we had last year as part of this nature positive trade work that we've been doing on biodiversity. And we actually work with UN Trade and Development, the new branding of UNCTAD, as part of those consultations. We ran these consultations last year with stakeholders in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. And we went there physically and also online. And the idea was to bring the stakeholders that are not coming to Geneva, that are not at the negotiation table, but they will be affected by any decisions in the trade policy and in the trade system. And the idea was, well, I've been saying this in other discussions, but really to understand and take the pulse of the region. And the region is so diverse that even between countries there are differences. And the second part is, okay, now I have more clarity and understand what's the state of play, but then how do we build a vision that helps the region move forward? And we've been talking a lot about the WTO, and certainly comes natural, but we also see developments at the regional trade agreements. I mean, the AFCFTA is doing really important work with their second phase of negotiations on greening the agreements for the protocols that they have, with intellectual property, with competitiveness, with gender equality, with circular economy. And they have also identified key sectors that will not only boost their economy for international trade, but also intra-regional trade. So that's really an angle where we see a lot of opportunities, because those are agreements that exist, that have been revised or renegotiated, and those are the opportunities as well to bring the changes. If we think about the previous conversation of changing the rules, of using the rules in a different way. So that's one context, and we've been working a lot with the Commission, Economic Commission for Africa, and with UN Trade and Development in that particular context for the AFCFTA. So one of the key takeaways from these 3 consultations that we run was that there are already good things happening in those regions. So there are best practices, there are already better solutions that are working well. The problem is they are not escalated, or they don't have the infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, it's also the policy, but also the financing mechanism, so that those solutions can be used in maybe different contexts, but it can actually be replicated. And the second takeaway was the need for a more co-creative / consultative process. So today in this last session, we're talking about cooperation, and we say a lot dialogue, and we recognize that dialogue is important. And we think that the next step is, how do we foster that dialogue? How do we move from a dialogue to the action? And so this is one of the things that we have identified across these 3 regions, the appetite not only to be reactive to a regulation, and perhaps that's something that you were saying earlier, I think there's something that I need to regulate, and at some point becoming proactive. So eventually the countries could be at the forefront of a regulation. And we saw it in Africa, again, coming back to the AFCFTA and the Secretariat saying, we actually can build a hub in Africa where we have the research, where we have the policy advice, where we have the industry capacity, where we have the technical assistance for us to start dictating the agendas as well. So I think it's a bit of a mindset shift that we start seeing in some of those countries, and the importance of having these co-creative processes when regulations are developed, so that yes, the countries will put forward their commitments and their objectives, and equally for the trading partners, there'll be the enabling conditions for those new transactions to happen. And my last point, and I'll just end here, one of the examples that we're seeing with this collaboration that we have discussed earlier between, bringing trade, but also biodiversity communities, but also the finance community and development. We're now working with the Ministry of Finance. They have a coalition of ministers of finance, and they are developing their next work plan. And now we're integrating some elements of trade in that work plan. Their focus is going to be on climate for now. But that's really a starting point where the finance ministers are saying, let's try to find the linkages with trade for a specific agenda, in this particular case, climate. But if we try to see those opportunities and see how these could evolve in this topic of bioeconomy today, that is already showing that there's the willingness, but also the political leadership to start changing the discussion and eventually move from a dialogue to a more action-oriented approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Beatrice. I have Aaron and then Courtney. Can I put you on the spot, Courtney, afterwards? Yes. And Kolo, please. I didn't see that you had your hand up. I'll go Kolo, and then I'll go Aaron, and then Kolo, please.
I think Kolo is applauding.
Oh, you're applauding. Oh, okay.
I am applauding, but I would like to speak, but after at the end, if it's possible, after everybody who has put their hands up.
I'll be brief. I wanted to give a story of two very different policies and initiatives to highlight what I see as some of the important stuff coming out here about international cooperation, and then some thoughts that come from it. The first is the EU CBAM, which I know fairly well. I use it as an example, not of a regulation which I think has a great deal of impact on bioeconomy, because the covered products are industrial products. I think EUDR is a far better example, but I know CBAM better. And this is a policy that was put in place. You can have some sympathy for the EU. They put this thing in place because they are pioneering in terms of realistic, meaningful carbon pricing, and getting so far out ahead of the rest of the world that they're concerned about carbon leakage. They're concerned about competitiveness. They don't say competitiveness, but they are. And so, therefore, they have to put this thing in place that levels the playing field at the border. No problem. But that said, even if you support that kind of unilateral action and you see the necessity for it, you have to acknowledge the fact that it is going to have meaningful impacts on exporters, particularly in countries that don't have existing requirements for GHG reporting, particularly in industries that are not big and don't have those existing systems up and running already, particularly in countries that don't have the means to support the decarbonization of their domestic industries. And that, unfortunately, tends to be a description of developing and least developed countries, right? So those impacts are going to happen. Even if you see that as a completely justified unilateral action, those impacts are going to happen. And do we see any acknowledgement of that from the European Union in the form of recycling that revenue back into funds that might help in that decarbonization, recycling that revenue back into funds that might defray the cost of compliance for those industries? No, we don't. Not at all. Nothing. Zero. So let me give you another picture from a very different perspective. An interesting example that the cocoa trade is dominated by, I think 90% of it goes through 5 different buyers at the intermediate level. Although at the bottom end, it's huge. It's all smallholders, less than 2 hectares mostly. Concerned about sustainability and concerned about the fact that voluntary sustainability standards are a growing, ballooning share of international trade. They decided that they wanted to do something about that. But did they, well, instead of putting in place, this goes to your question, do you just demand that those things be complied with, or do you actually try to put positive incentives in place? they started a program of capacity building at smallholder level and cooperative level in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that tried to help the smallholders come up to best management practices in their cultivation, tried to provide finance for financial vehicles that were sustainable for the purchase of fertilizers and pesticides that weren't environmentally harmful. So in other words, it was an effort to try to create the enabling conditions that went along with their desire for a cleaner method of production, right? A very different model. And so from the contrast between those two, I take two things. First, I think it's the principle that, yeah, if you're going to do these kinds of unilateral demands that will see negative impacts, but may have wonderful environmental results, it is incumbent on you to, at the same time, try to help create the enabling conditions, particularly in developing and least developed countries, right? Just as a principle. But second, I note that that's a difficult lift. If we're asking the EU unilaterally, single-handedly, to engage in an exercise of industrial decarbonization around the world in the context of CBAM, or to help avoid deforestation around the world through capacity building in the context of EUDR, that's a heavy lift. And so we come back to international cooperation. I don't think it's possible to ask one country unilaterally taking that kind of action to do that. But as a cooperative effort, as an international effort, maybe that's more feasible. None of that's original, but.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So the team, we only have about 10 minutes left. It's been a marathon with no coffee break. I realized I should have said we had coffee outside. One thing I've learned is there's energy and interest to having a longer version of this discussion. But I mean, this is really a first effort to sort of stimulate something. And, you know, we've also covered such a vast terrain that it's hard to go deep on any particular issue. But I'll turn to Courtney and then actually to Courtney, Kolo, and then to Julie. Courtney, please.
Right. Well, thank you for giving me a few minutes just to feedback on what we've heard. I forget who it was, but someone mentioned, you know, a regional level, interregional trade. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about the bioeconomy is the level of different levels of cooperation that are needed. So, you know, the last person who spoke was talking about the need for international cooperation, particularly when we're looking at climate objectives, meeting climate objectives, and certainly, you know, I think there's an important role for international collaboration. There's been some academic research that on the regional level of cooperation and how that actually can filter in more, you know, local and national level. So I think when we think about the collaborations and you know, the levels of cooperation, it's important to think about the different levels and the different roles. I think there's something to be said about Africa, for example, having, you know, an African view on biotrade, and the same with, you know, with Mercosur or with the Organization of American States. So that's largely because if there's one thing that we saw in the stock take, it's that the issues that are important to the EU, to the different regions, the EU versus Latin America versus Africa, are really different. The drivers are different. And, you know, it's going to require political consensus at the regional level that then links to international cooperation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Courtney. Over to you, Kolo, please.
Yes, I'll be very brief because it's all been pretty much said before, but I think there's sort of two things that I would like to emphasize. One is the sort of the framing around, you know, the discussion around, you know, environment and climate and sustainability and trade, especially, you know, the thinking that the imports, you know, are problematic and therefore should be, unilaterally dealt with. But I think a broader discussion should really be taken into developing countries and trying, as was mentioned, to assist in sort of, the production in country in which developing countries that really have an advantage to, to leapfrog all of that and to really start producing sustainably, not only for export, right? Because also domestically, products need to be consumed, but rather to think about it from that perspective and, support, collaboration. And really what recently was discussed is plugging into regional initiatives that, countries are thinking about it, regionals are thinking about it. How does the international community plug into and support what is working or what looks like could work, in the region or in countries? Because as we all know, there are different interests and sort of different agendas. And I think sometimes, when we're looking at sort of even conservation, I just heard recently, some measures can be really, really, really successful, but then they become a problem. For example, right now, there's, an overpopulation of elephants in Botswana, and the Botswana president said, wow, we're going to ship off 20,000 elephants to Germany because, the EU has been telling us to save these elephants. So sometimes, although well-intentioned, some measures really had to be tweaked to the reality of regions. And I think when we think about cooperation, really think about, who is on the ground and how can we support this on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kolo. One of the things I was reminded of, we have quite a lot of discussions with developing country delegations here in Geneva. And the other aspect of this, which we haven't talked about quite so much, is the sort of, in a geo-economic kind of sense, and I think Blythe alluded to this earlier, that for many of the countries, these are now their assets in the global economy, their nature assets, their natural resources, their biodiversity, and they want to use these as a way to assert some power and some influence in the global economy, as well in an economy that there's very unequal access to finance and technology. They have something the world needs, and so we shouldn't underestimate, I think, that whole political underpinning to this as well. Over to you, please, Julie.
Thank you so much. And given that we have 5 minutes left, let me take the chance to also sort of offer some takeaways and kind of closing reflections from this conversation. First of all, a huge thanks to you, Carolyn, and to Mark for shepherding such a wide-ranging and productive conversation. Obviously, a key headline is that we have a lot to discuss in this domain of nature-positive trade and finance. And I think having a kind of affinity group or coalition of the willing like this getting together and trying to advance a collective understanding of the landscape and the risks and opportunities and perhaps even a shared agenda at some point is a really valuable endeavor. I really appreciated Marianne's point, the idea that the tools and pathways to get to nature positive trade are not the problem. It's really the sort of lack of proactive, coherent use of these tools and fundamentally that gets to making biodiversity, the climate crisis, and sustainable development a real center of gravity around which economic policy and trade orients. And we're obviously not there yet. And that's a broader question of political will as much as it is one of evidence and argumentation on behalf of the value and potential of nature positive trade approaches or some of the kind of technical and legal fixes we've discussed. It strikes me that trade governance overall has not really been properly branded in the kind of public and political imagination as a key source of misalignment of global finance with nature, nor held up as a key solution to the biodiversity and climate crisis in mainstream policy discussions to the degree that it can be. So it strikes me that maybe more work needs to be done there as well. Multiple people made the point, which is absolutely true, that the bioeconomy is not inherently sustainable. And, certainly we don't want to see the burden shifted from fossil fuels to other harmful practices around things like land use conversion. So we really do need to build a clear vision of what a sustainable nature positive bioeconomy looks like with metrics and definitions that link to the global biodiversity framework and a sense of what the guardrails and red lines are. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done there. It's a big priority that emerged from the G20 global bioeconomy stocktake effort that Courtney helped lead for us, and a recommendation for Brazil's bioeconomy working group effort as one of the kind of central focal points of effort within that group. Clearly, in terms of a sustainable bioeconomy, circularity is really key, and that involves, a system that incentivizes this, along with preferential treatment and tariffs for nature positive goods and services, and subsidies that reward biodiversity sensitive products and penalize nature destructive practices. It seems like building out the details of what that could look like is a really critical project. And I imagine there's some overlap with the green taxonomy work that many countries are already now deeply involved with in the EU, Kenya, and elsewhere. The discussion on circularity brings to the forefront for me questions more broadly of localization and regionalization of trade. So discriminating not just on sort of how goods are produced, but where they are produced and the carbon nature footprint involved in transporting them to different markets. I think that gets to Cookie's point earlier about how much we can really work within the current system versus some more fundamental changes to trade governance that we need to think about. I really liked the idea that Antoine proposed around NB-SAPs and having an articulation there of the relationship between trade agreements and GBF commitments. And I also really like Chantal's point about linking the updating of NDCs more explicitly to biodiversity and GBF commitments. That seems like a really important near-term opportunity. Maybe lastly, I think John's point was really important around the bioeconomy opportunity landscape for low and middle income countries, for small island developing nations. There are real opportunities there, but as we know, much of the bioeconomy is capital intensive, it's technology intensive. Helping these countries catch up and compete is going to require a lot of intentional work and financing. It relates finally to the points that Peter and Vincent and others have raised around efforts like the EUDR and CBAM, and thinking about concretely what are the alternatives to these more unilateral approaches. Is it a better, longer, more multilateral process, but that still involves the sort of supply chain exclusion strategy in key consumer markets? To Vincent's point, does it involve much more kind of SME transition fund support? Can we think about a CBAM for low and middle income countries for EU products entering their markets? Can we think, to Erin's point, about CBAM funds, proposals to recycle those revenues into transition funds for low and middle income countries? Do we want to reimagine altogether, an approach that's more like a mutually agreed export tax for carbon intensive goods that low and middle income countries collect themselves rather than accruing to EU countries? So all this to say, I would love to think together more with this group about what our vision of the good looks like in this domain in more concrete terms. And thank you very much to everybody for your contributions today.
So thank you very much, Julie, for those reflections. I don't have much to add. It's already 5 o'clock, but I do think just 3 quick points. Firstly, this conversation today has really emphasized me the power of bringing different constituencies together. I mean, we have what we call the trade and environment community, sort of people in the environment and trade community who follow each other, sort of a fairly small, nerdy community. Sometimes it expands to the trade, environment, and sustainable development community. But in reality, what we've seen today is we really need to leverage the power of the environment community as environment community. One of the things we've been missing in the trade and sustainability discussion is the engagement of the big environment advocates, whether it's IUCN or WWF or WRI, some of these really big players. Nature Positive was here today, which was fantastic as well. And then at the same time, we've been missing the financing. I mean, I was in Davos in the SDG tent, and it was just extraordinary, this whole nature positive finance agenda there, so vibrant, dynamic, big money on the table, and yet it's completely separate to our kind of quite sad and hamstrung kind of trade discussion in this arena. And yet, there are exciting things going on, as Beatrice said, in different contexts in the trade, at regional levels and sectoral levels and so on. So I do think there's this need to sort of energize this discussion and as Marianne said, about putting some political will behind it. So I'm very conscious there are many conversations beyond this room going on. I mean, there have been convenings on this by different types of people and different IDOs and so on, bringing people together, the work of Trade Hub and so on in that regard. But I like the idea that Julie said of an affinity group. So I just want to offer, if it's useful, to consider this as a sort of informal affinity group where we can continue to explore some of these issues. We, you know, are happy to think about keeping this conversation going, because I do think the power of, there's significant power in this room in terms of the different constituencies that we have the capacity to bring to the conversation and to elevate it up. So it's not only a technical discussion, but we can bring some political energy behind it. We have different networks that can help build that conversation. So that's really my the only add-on that I have at the end. And the final one is, I think many people today mentioned this idea of vision. And it strikes me that I read lots of papers about nature positive finance and nature-based economy and nature positive economy, but we have good stuff on nature positive trade, but I don't think we have yet that kind of vision, or several, you know, there's not going to be one, there's going to be several overlapping and interconnecting visions, but I think probably we need a bit more of the 1 or 2 page versions of like, what is this about? What do we need trade to do and the trading system to do to support the nature economy? And we probably just need more writing about that kind of vision and that it matters. And also emphasizing this point that Courtney, I was amazed at the beginning when you were talking about the sheer numbers and scale of the growth of the bioeconomy, what we're asking nature to do for us to solve problems, nature-based solutions and so on, what companies and countries are trying to do to harness their resources, at the same time knowing that we're causing devastation everywhere, right? So there's sort of this, there's a huge issue there, and I'm not sure that the many dimensions of that are well understood. And so anyway, that will close us off to today, but I think hopefully we have spurred a positive forward-looking discussion on what kind of trading system we need, and that we need to have a discussion about what kind of trading system we need to support nature positive outcomes. So thank you all again for taking the time. Thank you to all of those who've done so much work to get this issue on the agenda. I'm sorry, Chantaline, I don't think we replied to all of your questions before, but I think we have spurred a great conversation. Thank you all again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
We finished within 5 minutes.